Pack your things and get out of here. My smug son-in-law tossed my duffel bag into the freezing rain. We need the space for my parents. This house belongs to us now. My own daughter added her arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. I did not beg. I did not shed a single tear. I just turned around and walked away into the dark. But they had no idea that their arrogant eviction was the final step in a trap I had set months ago. When the lawyer knocked on their door a few days later, their triumphant smiles vanished, replaced by absolute panic. Wait, this cannot be right. Tell us this is not true. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my greedy son-in-law's entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that arrogance should always be punished with cold, hard facts. My name is Vincent Sterling. I am 72 years old, and for the past 50 years, I built a life brick by brick in Chicago. I am a retired urban planning contractor. My hands are calloused. My back aches when the weather turns cold, and my skin carries the deep, rich history of an African-American man who survived and thrived in a cutthroat industry. I built the very house I was standing in. My late wife Vivian and I poured our blood, sweat, and savings into this custom-built wood and stone sanctuary. It was our dream home, our fortress, the place where we raised our only daughter Maya. But tonight, that dream was being hijacked by the very people who were supposed to be family. It was a bitter Tuesday evening in December. The wind chill off Lake Michigan was brutal, rattling the window panes like a warning. But the chill inside my living room was far worse. I was standing near the entryway watching Chad, my daughter Maya's husband, drop my battered canvas duffel bag onto the hardwood floor and kick it toward the front door. Chad is 35, a white hotshot real estate broker with slicked back hair, a tailored suit he cannot really afford, and an ego the size of the Willis Tower. Pack your things and get out of here, Vince. Chad commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. You have overstayed your welcome. I looked past him into the living room. Sitting on the leather sofa I bought with Vivian for our 30th anniversary were Chad's parents, Richard and Beatrice Preston. They were sipping my expensive bourbon, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute disdain. They had always looked down on me. To them, I was just a blue-collar worker who got lucky, a stubborn old black man taking up valuable space in a premium zip code. They had recently sold their modest condo in the suburbs to pay off some debts and needed a place to stay while they looked for a luxury downtown apartment. My house was apparently their perfect permanent solution. I turned my gaze to Maya, my own flesh and blood. The little girl I had worked 80-hour weeks for, the daughter I had put through private school and college without a single student loan. She was standing by the fireplace, her arms tightly crossed across her chest. She refused to meet my eyes, staring intensely at a spot on the rug. Maya, I said, keeping my voice steady, deep, and unnervingly calm. What is the meaning of this? She finally looked up, her expression hardened by the toxic influence of her husband's family. It is time for you to go, Dad, she said coldly. Our names are on the deed now. You signed the papers last month. Chad's parents need a place to stay right now, and this house is just too big for one person. It is our property. You need to find yourself a nursing home, or a small apartment. We will even pack the rest of your clothes and send them to you. The betrayal was a physical blow to my chest, but my face remained an unreadable mask. 50 years in the construction and urban planning business taught me that when a structure is compromised, you do not stand underneath and scream. You step back, assess the structural integrity, and prepare for the demolition. They had been pressing me for months to add their names to the deed. Chad claimed it was for estate planning purposes to avoid probate taxes if something happened to me. Maya begged, playing on my emotions, saying it would make them feel secure about the future. I knew Chad's financial situation was a house of cards. His real estate firm was struggling, his luxury car was leased, and his flashy lifestyle was funded entirely by credit. I knew they wanted the house to leverage its value to save his sinking ship. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg. I did not remind Maya of her mother's dying wish for us to stay close. I simply looked at the three of them. Richard and Beatrice were smirking. Chad was standing tall, puffing out his chest, completely confident in his perceived victory over an old, uneducated man. I slowly walked over to my duffel bag. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the few belongings I had packed when Chad cornered me in my bedroom an hour ago and told me to get out. I slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked directly into Chad's eyes. Chad, I said, my voice low and gravelly. "Are you absolutely sure you read that paperwork carefully?" Chad let out a loud, mocking laugh. He adjusted his expensive watch and smirked at his parents. "Do not worry about me, old man. I am a licensed real estate professional. I read the deed. The house is legally transferred to Maya and me. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. You have zero legal claim to this property anymore. Now take your bag and walk out before I have to call the police and report a trespasser. A trespasser in the house I built for my wife." The audacity was almost impressive. Beatrice chimed in from the sofa, swirling her bourbon with a manicured hand. "It really is for the best, Vincent. You really should be around people your own age anyway. We will take excellent care of this place. We might even redecorate. It is a bit dated, do you not think, Richard? It needs a brighter, more refined aesthetic." Richard chuckled, looking at my custom mahogany shelves. "Definitely needs a modern, civilized touch." I nodded slowly. I did not give them the satisfaction of my anger. I did not give them the tears they probably expected to see from a broken father. I just tightened my grip on my bag. "Enjoy the house." "Chad," I said calmly. I turned the brass knob, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain. The icy wind whipped against my face, instantly soaking my jacket. I heard the door slam shut behind me, followed by the distinct heavy click of the deadbolt locking. They were locking me out of my own life. I walked down the long driveway, the freezing rain mixing with the gravel beneath my boots. I reached the end of the street where a taxi I had called 20 minutes earlier was waiting, its headlights cutting through the violent storm. I climbed into the back seat, shaking the water from my coat. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, looking at me through the rearview mirror. "The downtown Marriott," I replied. As the taxi pulled away, leaving the house I had loved in the rearview mirror, I did not feel a sense of loss. I felt the cold, sharp focus of a hunter who had just watched his prey step willingly into a steel trap. Chad thought he was a genius. He thought his real estate license and his smooth talking had outsmarted a retired black contractor. He thought he had just secured a multi-million-dollar asset for absolutely nothing. But Chad made the fatal mistake that arrogant people always make. He assumed that because I wore work boots and flannel because I worked with my hands, I did not understand the intricacies of property law better than he did. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. I dialed a number I had programmed on speed dial. It rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered the line. Sterling and Associates. Graham speaking. "Graham, it is Vince," I said, looking out at the city lights blurring in the rain against the window. "Vince. Good evening." "Did it happen?" Graham asked. "Just exactly as we predicted," I replied. "Chad just threw me out into the rain." Maya stood there and watched. He practically bragged about reading the deed. I could hear the satisfied, dangerous smile in Graham's voice. He read the deed, but he certainly did not check the county registry for the underlying parcel division, did he? No, he did not. I said, a grim smile, finally touching my lips. "Activate the subdivision clause tomorrow morning, Graham. They took the bait. It is time to drop the hammer. Consider it done, Vince. Get some rest tonight. The real fun starts very soon." I hung up the phone and leaned back against the leather seat of the taxi. I was 72 years old, but tonight I felt reborn. Maya and Chad wanted my property. They wanted to strip me of my dignity and throw me to the curb so his entitled racist parents could drink my liquor and live in my home. But they were about to learn a brutal lesson in urban planning and legal strategy. When you try to evict the architect from the building he designed, you better make absolutely sure you own the ground it is standing on. And Chad Preston, the hotshot real estate broker, was about to discover that he owned absolutely nothing but the wood and the bricks. The dirt beneath his feet belonged to me, and the rent was about to be due. The taxi dropped me off at the entrance of the downtown Marriott. The bellhop rushed forward to take my battered canvas duffel bag, his eyes briefly registering the sharp contrast between my worn work boots, my damp jacket, and the polished marble floors of the lobby. I did not care. I walked straight up to the reception desk, pulled out my old leather wallet, and handed the clerk a solid metal American Express Centurion card. The heavy black card clinked against the marble counter. The young clerk's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second before morphing into absolute deference. Suddenly, the old black man in the wet clothes was not a vagrant asking for directions. He was a VIP. I took the private elevator up to the penthouse suite. As I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline, I thought about Chad. My arrogant, foolish son-in-law genuinely believed I was just an uneducated carpenter, a relic from a bygone era who spent his entire life swinging a hammer. He saw my calloused hands, heard my quiet demeanor, and assumed a total lack of intellect. He never bothered to look up the name Vincent Sterling in the city archives. If he had done his research, he would have learned that I did not just swing a hammer. I spent 40 years as a senior urban planner and commercial contractor for the city of Chicago. I navigated complex zoning laws, parcel subdivisions, and commercial land development long before Chad even knew how to tie his own shoelaces. Vivian and I built that beautiful custom wood house with our own hands, that much was true. But the dirt it sits on, the prime $3 million acre of land nestled in one of the city's most coveted and expensive neighborhoods, does not belong to the physical house. It belongs to Sterling Holdings, a private limited liability company of which I am the sole and absolute owner. Chad forced me to sign over the deed to the physical structure. He now legally owned the bricks, the wood, the roof, and the plumbing, but he did not own a single blade of grass beneath it. The legal term for this is a ground lease, and Chad's lease was about to become his worst nightmare. My phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, breaking the silence of the luxury suite. The screen flashed with Chad's name. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the view of the city before slowly sliding my finger across the glass to answer. "Listen to me, old man." Chad's voice barked through the speaker, thick with unearned authority and disrespect. "I am looking at the mail we just brought in from the porch. There is an electricity bill here for $400 from last month. You need to pay this immediately." I took a slow sip of my water. "Is that right?" I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "Do not play games with me, Vince," Chad sneered. "Maya and I are the legal owners of this property now. We have no obligation to pay your past debts. We are already doing you a massive favor by not coming after you for property damage for the scratches on the hardwood floors in the hallway. You pay this electrical bill by tomorrow morning, or I will have my lawyer send you a formal demand letter. You are lucky we are letting you walk away cleanly." I listened to the smug satisfaction radiating from his voice. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of bullying an old man. He felt powerful. He felt completely invincible, standing in my living room drinking my liquor surrounded by his pretentious parents. "Chad," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion, "have your lawyers read the county property files very, very carefully before they draft that demand letter. Have a good night." I pressed end. I did not wait for his response. I blocked his number immediately. There is no point in arguing with a man who is actively digging his own grave. You just stand back and hand him a bigger shovel. I slept deeply that night. The king-sized bed was comfortable, but it was the profound piece of a flawless, devastating strategy that truly rested my bones. I woke up just after sunrise. I ordered dark coffee and a quiet breakfast to the room, watching the morning light wash over the skyscrapers. I was just reviewing an email from my lawyer Graham, confirming that the subdivision documents had been officially pulled from escrow when my phone chimed with a text message. It was from Marcus, my old neighbor who lived across the street from my house. The message contained a video file and a short, frantic text. "Vince, what is happening over there? I thought you said you were just doing some light redecorating." I tapped the video to play it. The footage was shaky shot from Marcus's front porch, but the audio and visuals were crystal clear. A heavy yellow backhoe excavator was parked on my front lawn. Its thick metal tracks were tearing deep, muddy gashes into the pristine grass I had manicured for decades. But the machine was not just tearing up the lawn. It was positioned directly in front of the southern bay windows, right where Vivian's rose garden stood. Vivian had planted those roses 30 years ago. She had cultivated rare, deep red and climbing white roses that wrapped perfectly around the custom wooden trellises I had built for her with my own 2 hands. When she got sick, when the cancer took her strength and kept her confined to the house, her only joy was sitting by that window and watching those roses bloom. After she passed away, that garden became sacred ground to me. I tended to it every single day. Maya knew this. My daughter knew that garden was her mother's living legacy. In the video, Chad was standing on the porch holding a cup of coffee wearing a tailored winter coat. He was pointing his finger aggressively, directing the excavator operator. Beatrice and Richard, his parents, were standing next to him, pointing at the flowers and laughing. "Tear it all out," Chad shouted over the roar of the heavy diesel engine. "The whole bed. Rip it up. We need the ground leveled for my parents' new swimming pool. Clear out all those ugly, thorny bushes right now." I I watched the heavy metal teeth of the excavator bucket drop. I watched it violently rip into the earth, tearing the wooden trellises from the brick walls, shattering the timber, and uprooting 30 years of my dead wife's love in a single brutal motion. The beautiful red petals were crushed into the freezing mud under the heavy steel treads. Maya walked out onto the porch. She looked at the destroyed garden, the torn-up earth where her mother used to spend her afternoons. For a brief second, I thought I saw hesitation in her posture, but then Chad wrapped his arm around her waist, kissed her cheek, and whispered something in her ear. She nodded, turned her back on her mother's ruined garden, and went back inside the house without saying a word to stop them. The video ended. The screen went black. I sat in the utter silence of my penthouse suite. I did not shout. I did not throw my phone across the room. The cold, calculated patience that had guided me through the previous night vanished, entirely replaced by an absolute freezing fury. They did not just want my house. They wanted to erase my history. They wanted to pave over Vivian's memory with concrete so his entitled parents could have a place to swim in the summer. And Maya, the daughter we raised, stood by and let them desecrate her mother's life work just to please her arrogant husband. I picked up the phone and dialed Graham's number. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Vince. The paperwork is filed with the city. We are ready to move on your signal. We can send the formal legal notice by certified mail later this week," Graham said cheerfully. "Change of plans." "Graham," I said. My voice sounded foreign even to my own ears. It was heavy, dark, and completely devoid of mercy. "Do not mail the notice. I want it delivered in person. Today." Graham paused, sensing the sudden violent shift in my tone. "Did something happen, Vince?" "They dug up Vivian's roses," I said. There was a heavy, respectful silence on the line. Graham had been my corporate lawyer and friend for 20 years. He knew exactly what those roses meant to me. He knew what they represented. "I understand," Graham said softly, "all business now. Chad is hosting a housewarming party this afternoon to show off his new free mansion to his wealthy real estate investors and colleagues." I continued looking at the video thumbnail of the destroyed garden on my screen. "I want you to walk right into that party, Graham. I want you to walk right up to him in front of every single client he is trying to impress, and I want you to drop the guillotine. I will be there at 3 o'clock sharp," Graham promised. I hung up the phone. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the streets far below. Chad Preston thought he had successfully evicted a helpless, clueless old man. He thought he could bulldoze my past to build his own luxurious future. But he was about to learn that the ground he was standing on was a legal minefield, and I had just pressed the detonator. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse suite, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. When Chad demanded my keys and threw me out into the freezing rain, he was so blinded by his own arrogance that he forgot one crucial detail. I built that house. I wired every single room. The integrated smart home security system was registered to a private offshore server under my name. I still had complete visual and audio access to the entire property. I did not log in to spy. I logged in to disconnect the system and leave them in the dark. But before I could hit the deactivate button, the live feed from the living room caught my attention. Richard and Beatrice Preston were standing in the center of the main hall. They were holding mugs of expensive coffee that I had purchased, examining the hand-carved mahogany archways and the deep, rich Brazilian walnut floors that my late wife Vivian and I had spent 2 years sourcing. I had designed that space to reflect warmth, history, and strength. It was a testament to our success. Beatrice waved her manicured hand with a look of absolute disgust. "It is just so incredibly dark and heavy," she complained, her voice echoing clearly through my laptop speakers. "It has that very specific older generation urban aesthetic." "You know what I mean, Richard. It feels a bit too ethnic for a modern, civilized neighborhood, like a blues club from the 70s. We simply cannot host our high society friends in a place that looks like this." Richard chuckled, tapping his expensive shoes against my hardwood floors. "Absolutely, Beatrice. It lacks refinement. It lacks class. We will have contractors come in tomorrow. We will paint all this depressing dark wood stark white. We will rip up these heavy tribal rugs and put down some sleek marble. We need to wash out the ghetto chic vibe and civilize the place before the housewarming party." My blood turned to ice, but not because of their blatant, thinly veiled racism. I expected that from them. What broke my heart was what happened next. My daughter Maya walked into the frame. She heard everything they said, the house her mother had loved, the culture her father had proudly embedded into the architecture was being mocked and degraded. I waited for her to defend her legacy. I waited for the strong, educated black woman I had raised to put them in their place. Instead, Maya smiled a weak, desperate smile. She nodded eagerly, desperate to please her white in-laws. "You are completely right," Beatrice, Maya said. "It is so terribly dated. Dad always insisted on these heavy, depressing colors. Do not worry. We will modernize it completely. We will erase all of this and make it bright and elegant just the way you like it." I closed my laptop. The soft click of the screen shutting echoed in the silent hotel room. The last tether of paternal guilt I felt toward Maya snapped and dissolved into nothing. She had traded her heritage, her pride, and her mother's memory for the shallow acceptance of people who would never truly see her as an equal. They wanted to erase my history. They wanted to whitewash my legacy. I decided right then that I would not leave them a single wall to paint. I took a hot shower, shaved, and put on a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect in any boardroom. I left the hotel and flagged down a taxi, giving the driver the address to the Chicago Department of City Planning. I had spent 4 decades walking those marble halls. I knew the security guards, the zoning clerks, and the directors. I knew the bureaucratic machine better than the arrogant real estate brokers who thought they ran the city. I walked straight up to the executive floor and entered the office of Harrison Vance, the regional director of infrastructure. Harrison and I went way back. For the last 5 years, Harrison had been calling my personal phone every few months, begging me to sell my property. The city had a massive multi-billion-dollar highway expansion project approved and funded. They needed to build a massive off-ramp to alleviate downtown traffic, and my specific acre of land was the exact geographical choke point blocking their blueprints. For 5 years, I told the city the land was absolutely not for sale at any price. Vivian had loved that plot. Her soul rested in the soil of her rose garden. But Vivian's garden was gone, violently destroyed by Chad's bulldozer just a day ago. The land was just dirt now, dirt that was about to serve a very specific, highly destructive purpose. Harrison nearly dropped his coffee mug when I walked into his office. "Vince," he said, his eyes wide with surprise. "What brings you out of retirement?" I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk, resting my hands on my cane. "Print the acquisition contracts, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am ready to sell you the ground lease." Harrison could barely contain his excitement. The city had previously authorized a hostile eminent domain takeover, but they desperately preferred a clean voluntary sale to avoid years of negative press and litigation. He pulled up the documents immediately. The standing offer was $4 million direct wire transfer cleared within 48 hours. I read the contract thoroughly. It was airtight. But I had one non-negotiable condition. "Harrison, I am selling you the land," I explained. "The dirt, the legal ground lease. But there is a physical structure sitting on this land that legally belongs to someone else, a man named Chad Preston." I signed the deed to the physical house over to him. Harrison frowned, pausing with his pen hovering over the paper. "That complicates things, Vince. The city needs the land completely cleared for the heavy machinery. We cannot have a squatter tying us up in court over a residential building." "He is not a squatter," I said smoothly. "He is the legal owner of the bricks and the wood. But you and I both know Municipal Code Section 4B perfectly. If the underlying land is acquired by the city for critical state infrastructure, the owner of any standing structure has exactly 30 days to relocate their building. If they do not physically move the house off the newly acquired city property, the city will demolish it at the structure owner's expense." Harrison looked at me, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. He realized exactly what I was doing. "You want us to issue an expedited clearance mandate," he said. "I want the notice drafted, stamped, and delivered today," I said, picking up the pen and signing my name on the $4 million transfer deed. The ink dried quickly. I was now $4 million richer. But more importantly, the city of Chicago was now the absolute legal owner of the land beneath Chad Preston's feet. The bureaucratic machinery of the city moves incredibly slow for ordinary citizens. But when they have a multi-billion-dollar highway project on the line, they move like a loaded freight train. Harrison stamped the approval with a heavy thud. "A city marshal will deliver the 30-day demolition mandate this afternoon," Harrison assured me. "If this Chad Preston does not physically lift his custom house and move it off our property in exactly 30 days, we will crush it into dust. And we will send him the bill for the bulldozer fuel and the debris removal." I thanked Harrison, shook his hand, and walked out of the building. The freezing Chicago wind felt strangely refreshing against my face. Chad thought he was a genius. He was hosting a massive, extravagant housewarming party tonight. He had invited all his wealthy investors, his arrogant real estate colleagues, and his snobby parents to celebrate his brilliant acquisition of a free mansion. He was going to drink champagne and brag about how he outsmarted a naive old black man. He had absolutely no idea that he was throwing a party inside a building that was officially scheduled for execution. The clock was ticking and the wrecking ball was already on its way. I sat in a dimly lit booth at a quiet working-class tavern directly across the street from my property. I ordered a neat glass of bourbon. The amber liquid burned my throat, matching the quiet, controlled fire burning in my chest. Through the rain-streaked window of the tavern, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the sprawling custom home Vivian and I had designed. Tonight it was lit up like a Christmas tree. Valets were running back and forth in the freezing rain, parking a parade of leased luxury vehicles on the gravel driveway I had laid with my own hands. Chad was throwing his extravagant housewarming party. He invited the absolute worst kind of people. Wealthy, pretentious real estate developers, aggressive commercial investors, and corporate sharks. These were the exact people he desperately needed to impress to save his failing brokerage firm. He was using my house as a giant stolen billboard to project an illusion of immense success and wealth. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and placed a single wireless earbud into my right ear. When Chad kicked me out, he was so blinded by his own victory that he forgot who installed the smart home system. I had disabled the security cameras earlier to avoid any legal gray areas regarding video recording, but I left the high-fidelity audio receivers active. The microphones I had embedded in the ceiling beams were highly sensitive. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the party flooded my ear. I heard the clinking of crystal champagne glasses, the loud fake laughter of corporate elites, and the smooth jazz playing from my custom surround sound system. I heard the sharp tapping of a silver spoon against a glass. The music faded out. Chad was taking center stage. I looked through the massive bay window across the street and saw him standing on the grand staircase landing. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne, grinning like a king overlooking his conquered territory. Maya stood a few steps below him, wearing a tight designer dress, looking more like a decorative accessory than a partner. His parents, Richard and Beatrice, were front and center, beaming with unearned pride. "Thank you all for coming tonight." Chad's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing directly into my ear. "Welcome to our new home. I know a lot of you have been asking how a boutique broker like me managed to secure a prime piece of real estate in this exact neighborhood without taking out a massive commercial mortgage. Well, let me tell you a little secret about the real estate game. It is not always about capital. Sometimes it is about recognizing an opportunity that is too old and too uneducated to know its own value." A wave of low laughter rippled through the crowd. My grip tightened around my bourbon glass, but my face remained an unreadable mask. Chad took a sip of his drink and continued. "My lovely wife Maya had a father who lived here. A stubborn old black guy, a blue-collar worker. He hammered nails for a living and somehow stumbled into this zip code decades ago before the property values skyrocketed. He was sitting on a gold mine but had absolutely zero financial literacy. So we did what any smart, aggressive investor would do. We convinced the old man he needed our protection. A few papers pushed across a dining table, a little legal jargon he could not possibly comprehend, and boom. He signed the deed over to us completely free of charge. We evicted him a few days ago. It was the easiest acquisition of my entire career. I literally got a multi-million-dollar mansion for free. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. I saw investors clapping him on the back through the window. They loved it. To them, I was not a human being. I was not a father who had sacrificed everything for his family. I was a foolish obstacle that had been successfully neutralized. I was the punchline to a cruel joke told by a mediocre white broker who had never built a single thing in his entire miserable life. I listened to my own daughter stay completely silent while her husband publicly humiliated my legacy. Maya did not defend me. She did not correct him. She just smiled, raised her glass, and soaked in the approval of people who would never respect her. She had completely sold her soul for a seat at their table. The bell above the tavern door chimed. I did not look away from the window. A man slid into the leather booth across from me. It was Graham, my corporate attorney. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit that cost more than the cars parked across the street. He shook the rain from his expensive umbrella and placed a thick black leather briefcase on the table between us. He looked through the window at the glowing house, then looked back at me. "They look like they are having a truly wonderful time," Graham noted. His voice was smooth and professional, but it was layered with a dangerous, predatory amusement. It would be an absolute tragedy if someone were to ruin the mood. I took a slow sip of my bourbon and set the glass down on the wooden table. "You have the documents?" I asked quietly. Graham patted the heavy briefcase. "I have the certified parcel subdivision records. I have the legal ground lease establishment proving you own the dirt. I have the demand for retroactive land rent. And most importantly, I have the 30-day demolition mandate officially stamped, signed, and authorized by the City of Chicago Infrastructure Director. Everything is perfectly legal, bulletproof, and ready for immediate delivery." I looked back at the house. Chad was pouring more champagne, laughing loudly with a group of older investors who were probably ready to hand him millions in capital based on the grand illusion of his success. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought his tailored suit and his skin color gave him an inherent, unquestionable right to take what belonged to me. He thought the game was over. "It is time, Graham," I said, my voice as cold as the wind outside. "Go knock on the door, hand the documents to him in front of everyone. Make sure his wealthy investors hear every single word you say." Graham smiled. It was the cold, calculating smile of a lawyer about to secure the ultimate kill. He picked up his briefcase, stood up, and buttoned his jacket. He walked out of the tavern and disappeared into the freezing rain. I sat alone in the booth, my eyes fixed firmly on the massive oak front door of my house. I watched Graham cross the street, his dark silhouette cutting through the harsh glare of the streetlights. He walked past the confused valets, stepped around the luxury cars, and walked up onto the wide front porch. Through the audio feed in my ear, the loud, arrogant chatter of the party continued. People were discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes. Chad was bragging loudly about his next big commercial development. Then the heavy brass knocker struck the solid oak door. 3 loud, distinct, authoritative thuds echoed through the grand foyer. The music seemed to quiet down. The loud conversations paused. Someone walked over and opened the heavy door. The storm was no longer just outside in the rain. It had officially arrived at their doorstep. The door creaked open. I heard the voice of a hired butler asking for an invitation. Graham did not even break his stride. I watched from across the street as my lawyer, a man who charged $1,000 an hour and earned every single penny of it, walked straight into the grand foyer. He did not take off his wet overcoat. He did not hand over his umbrella. He marched directly into the center of the living room like a judge entering a courtroom. The smooth jazz music was abruptly cut off. Through the window, I saw the crowd of wealthy investors part like the Red Sea. They were predators, and they instantly recognized a bigger, more dangerous predator walking into their territory. Chad was still standing on the lower steps of the grand staircase, his champagne glass frozen midair. Maya was right beside him, her fake smile faltering as she stared at the imposing figure of my attorney. Richard and Beatrice, Chad's parents, looked completely offended by the intrusion. "Excuse me?" Chad's voice echoed through my earpiece, loud and dripping with arrogant irritation. "Who are you? This is a private invite-only event. You cannot just walk into my house." Graham stopped right in front of the massive marble kitchen island. He placed his heavy black leather briefcase on the pristine surface. The dull thud resonated through the quiet room. He looked up at Chad, his expression completely devoid of warmth. "Good evening, Chad," Graham said, his voice projecting clearly across the room so that every single investor, developer, and banker could hear him. "My name is Graham Sterling. I am the senior partner at Sterling & Associates, and I represent Mr. Vincent Sterling, the man you so graciously bragged about evicting just a few moments ago." A collective murmur swept through the room. The investors exchanged confused and intrigued glances. They loved a good spectacle, especially when it involved someone else's money. Chad let out a forced, nervous laugh, trying to maintain his alpha male facade in front of his wealthy guests. He took a step down the stairs, trying to look imposing. "Oh, I see." The old man went crying to a lawyer. "Well, Mr. Sterling, you are wasting your billable hours. Maya and I are the legal registered owners of this property. The deed was signed, notarized, and filed. Your client gave it away. Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call the police." Graham did not flinch. He He did not raise his voice. He simply popped the two brass locks on his briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed in the silent house. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a thick rubber band. He tossed the stack onto the marble counter. It landed with a heavy smack that made Beatrice jump. "Congratulations," Chad Graham said, his tone sharp and lethal. "You are absolutely correct. You and your wife are the sole legal owners of the physical structure of this house. You own the brick walls, the custom mahogany arches, the roof shingles, and the Brazilian walnut floors you are currently standing on. It is a beautiful shell." Chad smirked, looking around at his guests as if he had just won an argument. "Exactly. We own the house. So get out." Graham held up a single finger, stopping Chad in his tracks. "You own the structure, Chad, but you do not own a single centimeter of the dirt it is sitting on." The smirk vanished from Chad's face. The room went dead silent. Graham picked up the first document and held it up. "My client, Mr. Vincent Sterling, is a former senior urban planner for the city of Chicago. 30 years ago, before this house was even a blueprint, he filed a parcel subdivision. He legally separated the physical structure of the home from the underlying land. He placed the land, 1 full acre of prime, $3 million real estate, into a private limited liability company." I sat in the dark tavern across the street, taking a slow sip of my bourbon. Through the window, I could see the exact moment the blood drained from Chad's face. His pale skin turned the color of ash. Beside him, Maya gripped the banister, her eyes wide with sudden terror. "That is a lie," Chad stammered, his voice losing all its previous boom and authority. He scrambled down the remaining steps and rushed to the marble island. I read the deed. I read the transfer of ownership. It said we have joint tenancy. "You read the residential transfer deed," Graham corrected him smoothly, handing him a highlighted page from the stack. "But because you were so blinded by your own greed and because you assumed my client was just a foolish, uneducated carpenter, you did not bother to check the county land registry. If you had done your due diligence as a so-called real estate professional, you would have seen the ground lease." The investors in the room started whispering loudly. These were seasoned real estate sharks. They knew exactly what a ground lease meant. They knew that owning a house on someone else's land was the ultimate financial death trap. I could hear their low voices through the earpiece. They were mocking him. They were realizing that the hotshot broker they thought was a genius was actually a complete amateur who had just walked blindly into a devastating legal snare. Chad grabbed the paper from Graham's hand. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon. His hands began to shake so violently that the paper rattled. "Look at page 4, section B." Graham instructed, his voice echoing like a judge handing down a sentence. The clause titled "Severance of Improvements from Real Property." It explicitly states that the transfer of the residential structure does not include the transfer of the parcel of land. Chad's eyes locked onto the bottom of the page. He stopped breathing. And right there at the bottom of that specific page, Graham continued relentlessly, "is your own signature. You signed it, Chad. You legally acknowledged that you were taking ownership of a house suspended in thin air with zero rights to the earth beneath it. You do not have a driveway. You do not have a front lawn. You do not even have the dirt beneath this marble floor. You own a very expensive wooden box sitting on my client's private property." No, this cannot be right," Chad gasped, his voice cracking. He flipped through the pages, frantically ripping the staples, looking for a loophole, a mistake, anything to save him from the absolute humiliation unfolding in front of his most important financial backers. "Maya, tell him this is not true. Your dad would not do this." Maya was completely frozen. She looked at the documents, then at Graham, and then she looked out the front window directly toward the dark street. She knew I was out there somewhere. She knew I had planned this perfectly. Richard and Beatrice pushed their way through the crowd of whispering guests. "What is going on, Chad?" Richard demanded, his face red with anger and confusion. "What does he mean we do not own the land? We sold our condo for this." Graham ignored the parents and kept his eyes locked on Chad. "You stood up here tonight and bragged about how easy it was to trick an old black man out of his wealth. You called him uneducated. You called him foolish. But Mr. Vincent Sterling designed this legal trap 20 years ago, long before he even met you. He built this house and he knew exactly how to protect it from scavengers like you." I watched from the tavern window as Chad physically stumbled backward, bumping into the counter. The champagne glass he had been holding so triumphantly just minutes ago slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the Brazilian walnut floor. The sharp crash of the crystal breaking was the loudest sound in the room. The grand illusion was shattered. The wealthy investors were already stepping away from him, pulling out their phones, whispering to their partners. They were distancing themselves from a sinking ship. No one was going to invest a single dime in a broker who did not even know how to read a basic land deed. Chad looked around the room, his eyes wild like a trapped animal. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by pure, suffocating panic. But Graham was not finished. The ground lease was just the beginning. The real punishment, the absolute financial destruction, was still sitting in Graham's briefcase, waiting to be delivered. I tapped my fingers against the tavern table, a cold smile forming on my lips. The trap had snapped shut, and now it was time to tighten the steel jaws. The shock in the grand foyer only lasted for about 10 seconds before Chad's panic mutated into pure, unadulterated rage. I watched through the tavern window as his face went from ash gray to a violent, blotchy red. His survival instinct kicked in, but because he was arrogant and cornered, his instinct was to scream. "Get the hell out of my house!" Chad bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the front door. "I am not playing these stupid legal games. You and that bitter old man manufactured some fake paperwork to humiliate me in front of my guests. I am calling the police right now and having you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Beatrice, his mother, quickly joined the chorus. "Yes, get out immediately. This is our son's property. You are ruining a beautiful evening with this ghetto nonsense." I took another slow sip of my bourbon. They were thrashing like fish in a net. Graham did not move a single inch. He just stood there, a perfectly tailored monument to impending doom. The wealthy investors in the room were watching him closely. They knew a bluff when they saw one, and Graham Sterling was definitely not bluffing. "Call the police, Chad." Graham said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Please do. The officers will gladly verify the county stamps on these documents. But before you dial 911, you might want to listen very closely to what I have to say next. Because the ground lease was just the prologue. We have not even reached the main event." Chad hesitated. His hand hovered over his phone. The room was so quiet I could hear the rain lashing against the windows through my earpiece. The investors leaned in. They smelled blood in the water. Graham reached into his black leather briefcase and pulled out a second document. He slapped it down onto the marble island right next to the ground lease. As I explained, Graham began adjusting his suit jacket. "You own this physical house, but my client owns the land beneath it. For the past several years, Mr. Vincent Sterling generously waived the ground rent because his daughter lived here. However, by legally forcing him to sign over the structural deed and violently evicting him into the freezing rain, you effectively terminated that grace period." Chad stared at the paper, his breathing shallow and erratic. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "I am talking about rent," Chad Graham replied, speaking slowly as if addressing a slow child. "According to the terms of the private LLC that owns this acre of prime Chicago real estate, any structure occupying this space without a grace waiver is subject to commercial ground rent. Because this is a premium lot, that rent is $15,000 a month. And since you assumed full ownership of the structure and evicted the landowner, your first month is due right now, $15,000 a month." The number echoed through the grand foyer. Maya gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Richard and Beatrice looked like they were going to faint. Chad stepped back, shaking his head frantically. "I am not paying that," Chad yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "That is extortion. I will take this to court. I will tie you and that old man up in litigation for years. I will drag this out until he is dead." Graham actually smiled. It was a terrifying sight, a shark showing its teeth. "You cannot take this to court," Chad Graham said softly, "because Mr. Sterling does not own this land anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. I tapped my fingers on the tavern table, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The final trapdoor was opening. Chad blinked, his confusion momentarily overriding his rage. "What do you mean he does not own it? You just said he owns the LLC. He did." Graham corrected him. "Until this morning. At 9 a.m. today, Mr. Vincent Sterling officially sold the entire parcel of land to the City of Chicago Department of City Planning for $4 million. The city desperately needs this exact acre for the new highway expansion project. The transaction is complete. The funds have cleared. You are no longer dealing with an old black man you think you can bully. You are now illegally squatting on property owned by the municipal government of Chicago." I watched Chad's knees physically buckle. He had to grab the edge of the marble island to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Maya let out a quiet sob. Graham pulled the final, most devastating document from his briefcase. It was a bright yellow sheet of paper bearing the official seal of the city infrastructure director. He slid it across the marble directly into Chad's trembling hands. "This is an expedited clearance mandate," Graham announced. "The city of Chicago does not care about your custom mahogany arches or your Brazilian walnut floors. They care about building an off-ramp. By law, as the owner of the physical structure, you have exactly 7 days to lift this entire mansion off its foundation and move it to another location." 7 days, Chad whispered, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. "That is impossible. You cannot move a house this size in 7 days. It would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I do not have a plot of land to put it on." "That sounds like a personal problem," Chad Graham said coldly. "Because if this structure is not completely removed from city property by next Tuesday, the city will bring in the bulldozers and crush it into dust. And as the legal owner of the structure, you will be billed $150,000 for the demolition and debris removal fees." The devastation was absolute. Chad Preston, the arrogant broker who thought he had secured a free mansion, had actually acquired a massive pile of worthless wood and brick that was scheduled for execution. He was legally trapped. If he stayed, he owed $15,000 in rent and would face municipal charges. If he did not move the house, it would be destroyed and he would be slapped with a $150,000 demolition bill that would instantly bankrupt him. He had thrown me out into the rain to steal my legacy, and in return I had handed him a financial death sentence. But the true destruction of Chad Preston did not come from the documents. It came from the audience. I watched through his tavern window as Marcus Thorne, a billionaire commercial developer and Chad's biggest potential investor, stepped forward from the crowd. Marcus was a ruthless businessman. He did not care about family drama, but he cared deeply about competence. And Chad had just proven himself to be the most incompetent man in Chicago. Chad Marcus said, his voice loud and clear over the audio feed. "You pitched us on your brilliant acquisition strategies. You wanted us to give you $20 million in capital for your new commercial fund. You stood there 10 minutes ago and bragged about how you secured this property for free by outsmarting your father-in-law." Chad turned to him, his eyes pleading. "Marcus, please listen to me. This is just a misunderstanding. I can fix this. I just need a bridge loan to cover the legal fees." Marcus shook his head in disgust. "You did not check the ground lease, Chad. You bought a house on stolen dirt. That is day one real estate law. If you are stupid enough to fall into a trap set by a retired contractor, you are way too stupid to handle our money." Marcus turned to the other investors. "We are done here. Gentlemen, let us go." The mass exodus began. The wealthy elites, the bankers, the developers Chad had spent months desperately courting all turned their backs on him. They walked toward the front door, leaving their champagne glasses on side tables and mantelpieces. Chad ran after them, literally begging, "Please do not leave. I have other properties. I have other deals lined up. Do not do this." Nobody even looked at him. They walked out the door, grabbing their coats, eager to distance themselves from the toxic sinking ship that was Chad Preston's career. Within 5 minutes, the grand housewarming party was completely dead. The only people left in the massive, echoing living room were Chad Maya, his horrified parents, and my lawyer. Graham snapped his briefcase shut. It was the sound of a coffin closing. "You have 7 days, Chad Graham said, walking calmly toward the front door. "I highly suggest you start packing. I hear cardboard boxes are cheap this time of year." Graham walked out into the rain, leaving the front door wide open. I sat in the tavern watching the cold wind blow into the grand foyer of my former home. Chad fell to his knees on the Brazilian walnut floor, burying his face in his hands. His mother Beatrice was screaming at him, demanding to know where they were going to live. Maya stood frozen, staring at the empty driveway, where all the luxury cars were quickly driving away. They wanted to erase my history. Instead, they had completely erased their own future. And I was just getting started. Through my earpiece, the grand foyer of my house sounded like a sinking ship. The heavy oak door had clicked shut, sealing my daughter, her arrogant husband, and his pretentious parents inside a tomb of their own making. I took the last sip of my bourbon, letting the slow burn ground me. I did not leave the tavern booth. I sat perfectly still in the dim light, watching the rain wash over the tavern window. I wanted to hear every single second of their empire collapsing. Beatrice was the first to break the heavy silence. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of that refined, high society tone she had practiced so carefully all evening. "What do you mean we have 7 days, Chad?" She was practically hyperventilating, her breathing ragged and loud over the audio feed. "Richard and I sold our condominium. We transferred the equity directly into your brokerage account to help you leverage this property. We have nowhere else to go. We gave up everything to move into this mansion." I could hear the frantic pacing of Chad's expensive leather shoes against the Brazilian walnut floors. "Calm down," Mother Chad snapped. His voice was trembling with barely suppressed panic, but he was still trying to play the alpha male. "I am going to fix this. It is a bluff. It has to be a bluff. The city cannot just demolish a custom-built home. There are injunctions. There are historical preservation stays. I just need to make a few phone calls." Richard did not share his son's delusional optimism. "A bluff," Richard yelled, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Did you not see the official city infrastructure seal on that mandate? Did you not hear Marcus Thorne, your biggest investor, laugh in your face and walk out the door? You told us this was a done deal. You told us that uneducated old man practically handed you the keys because he was too stupid to know what he was signing. Now you are telling me we are squatting on city property and owe $15,000 in rent by tomorrow morning." The panic in the room quickly mutated into a vicious, ugly blame game. And because Chad was a coward who could never take responsibility for his own failures, he turned his crosshairs directly on the easiest target in the room. He turned on my daughter. "This is your fault, Maya," Chad roared. The sudden aggression in his voice made me grip the edge of the tavern table. I listened closely, every muscle in my body tensing. "My fault," Maya cried out, her voice cracking with disbelief. "How is this my fault? I did exactly what you told me to do. I convinced him to sign the deed. I stood there and watched you throw my own father out into the freezing rain just so your parents could have his bedroom." "You left out one massive detail," Chad spat back, his tone dripping with venom. "You told me he was just a carpenter. You told me he poured concrete and hammered nails for a living. You never once mentioned that your father was a senior urban planner who spent 40 years writing the exact municipal codes that are currently suffocating us. You knew he owned that limited liability company. You knew about the ground lease." "I did not know." Maya sobbed. "He never talked to me about his business structure. He just provided for us. He just paid for my private school and my college. I thought he was just a lucky contractor. You are the licensed real estate broker, Chad. You were the one who brought the paperwork to the dining table. You were the one who said you ran a full title search." "Shut up," Chad screamed. "Just shut up. You set me up. You and that sly fox of a father played me." He smiled in my face while he tied a legal noose around my neck. "I am completely ruined. My investors are gone. My firm is going to bleed out by Friday." I sat in the dark booth listening to my daughter weep. A part of me, the father who had held her when she scraped her knee, wanted to walk across the street, kick the door down, and pull her out of that toxic environment. But the man who had survived the brutal streets of Chicago, the man who knew that true lessons are only learned through absolute pain, stayed perfectly still. Maya had made her choice. She traded her loyalty and her heritage for the illusion of status among people who hated her. Now she had to navigate the wreckage she helped create. I finally left the tavern around midnight, taking a taxi back to my penthouse suite, but I did not sleep. I kept the audio feed running through the night. The house was a pressure cooker of severe anxiety. Nobody slept. I heard doors slamming, Beatrice crying hysterically in the guest bedroom, and Chad frantically pacing the living room floor, making desperate phone calls to other investors who all sent him straight to voicemail. The real reality check came the next morning. I was sitting at the glass dining table in my hotel room eating a hot breakfast and looking out at the city skyline. The audio feed picked up Chad dialing his personal attorney on speakerphone in the kitchen. He needed an aggressive shark, someone who could bully the city and tie me up in endless litigation. He called a high-powered defense lawyer named Miller, a man known for dragging out real estate disputes for years. "Miller, thank God you answered," Chad said, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I need you to file an emergency injunction against the City of Chicago Infrastructure Department. I also need you to draft a massive civil lawsuit against Vincent Sterling for fraudulent misrepresentation and bad faith dealings. He tricked me into signing a structural deed without disclosing the ground lease." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. The speakerphone broadcasted Miller's voice perfectly. "Chad, I reviewed the documents you emailed me at 3 in the morning. All of them," Great Chad said eagerly. "So we can file the injunction today. We can block the demolition mandate before the end of the week." Listen to me very carefully, Chad Miller said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. I am not filing anything. I am not taking this case. What do you mean you are not taking the case? Chad demanded, his panic spiking again. You are my lawyer. I pay your retainer. Your retainer account is empty, Chad Miller replied coldly. And even if you handed me a blank check right now, I would not touch this radioactive mess with a 10-foot pole. I looked at the parcel subdivision. I looked at the ground lease. I looked at the transfer deed you willingly signed. Vincent Sterling did not trick you. He executed a flawless, legally perfect maneuver. The documents are ironclad. He owned the dirt. He kept the dirt. He gave you the wood and the bricks, and you signed an acknowledgement of severance. But he did not disclose the city acquisition, Chad argued desperately. He knew the city wanted the land. That is bad faith. It is not bad faith to sell your own private property to the municipal government. Miller shot back, sounding annoyed. He was the sole owner of the land. He had zero legal obligation to inform the owner of the physical structure about his land transactions. You failed to perform basic due diligence. Any first-year law student would have checked the underlying parcel ownership before assuming a deed. You acted arrogant. You moved too fast, and you walked right into a perfectly legal trap set by a man who is clearly much smarter than you are. There has to be a loophole. Chad pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. There is always a loophole. I will lose everything. The city is demanding $150,000 for demolition fees if I do not move the house in 6 days. I do not have that kind of cash. My business accounts are overdrawn. My parents gave me all their equity. Then I highly suggest you declare personal and professional bankruptcy immediately, Miller advised. Because if you try to fight the city of Chicago on an eminent domain acquisition where they already hold the clear title, they will absolutely crush you. They will garnish your future wages. They will seize your firm's remaining assets. You have no legal legs to stand on, Chad. You are completely cornered. Do not call this office again. The phone clicked. The dial tone echoed loudly through my custom kitchen. I heard a loud, violent crash. Chad had picked up one of Vivian's favorite ceramic vases and hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering clay was followed by a long, agonizing scream of pure defeat. He was trapped. He had no money, no investors, no lawyer, and no escape route. The walls of the beautiful home he thought he had stolen were literally closing in on him. The wrecking ball was coming, and he was chained to the foundation, but he still had not suffered enough. I had one more financial blow to deliver, and it was going to break him in half. The glowing screen of my smartphone illuminated the dark mahogany coffee table in my penthouse suite. It was buzzing, violently vibrating against the glass. The caller ID displayed a name I had spent my entire life trying to protect. Maya, my only daughter. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the teenager I had shielded from the harsh realities of the world, and the grown woman who had stood silently with her arms crossed while her husband threw my life into the freezing rain. I let it ring. I sat back in the leather armchair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I knew this call was coming. When the high-priced defense lawyer hung up on Chad, when the reality of absolute financial ruin finally pierced their bubble of arrogance, I knew they would look for an escape hatch. And historically, I had always been Maya's escape hatch. Whenever she made a mistake, whenever she overdrew her bank account or failed a class, I was the one who quietly fixed it. She was calling me now because she expected the old forgiving father to answer. But that father died the moment she let them bulldoze her mother's rose garden. On the fifth ring, I reached out and slid my finger across the smooth glass of the screen. I brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed, letting the heavy, cold silence stretch across the line. Dad, are you there? Maya's voice cracked through the speaker. It was not the cold, dismissive tone she had used in my living room 3 nights ago. This voice was frantic trembling, soaked in thick, desperate tears. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire fake empire burn to the ground. I am here, Maya, I said. My voice was low, deep, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the voice of a contractor assessing a condemned building. Dad, please, you have to stop this, she sobbed, her breath hitching wildly. You are destroying us. Chad is literally having a panic attack on the kitchen floor. His parents are throwing their clothes into garbage bags because they are terrified the city is going to send the demolition crews while they are sleeping. We have no money, Dad. The investors walked out. Chad's business accounts are completely empty. You have made your point. You won. Please just call the city and reverse the sale. I am your daughter. I listened to her weep. Decades ago, the sound of her crying would have moved mountains for me. I would have moved heaven and earth to dry her tears. But today her tears just sounded like a cheap negotiation tactic. "You were my daughter," I corrected her calmly. "The woman crying on this phone is just a stranger experiencing the consequences of her own actions." "Dad, please do not say that," she wailed, her voice echoing with absolute desperation. "I did not want to do this to you. I swear I did not want to. Chad forced me. He pressured me every single day. He told me his real estate firm was going under and that leveraging your house was the only way to save our marriage. His parents were constantly in my ear, judging me, making me feel like I did not belong in their family unless I proved my loyalty to them. I was scared. I was trapped. I did not know what else to do. Her excuses were pathetic. She was trying to play the victim, trying to gaslight me into believing she was just a helpless bystander in my eviction. My jaw tightened, but my voice remained perfectly level. Trapped. I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a heavy stone. "You were not trapped, Maya. You drove a leased luxury car to country club dinners while I worked overtime to pay for your education. You stood in the grand foyer of the house your mother and I built with our bare, bleeding hands. You watched a mediocre, arrogant man throw my winter coat and my duffel bag out into the freezing Chicago storm. I looked at you, Maya. I looked right into your eyes before I walked out that door. You did not look trapped. You looked inconvenienced." She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. Mom would be horrified if she saw what is happening to us. She would never want you to do this to me." The mention of her mother was a fatal mistake. A cold, dark fury ignited in the center of my chest, burning away any microscopic trace of mercy I might have had left. "Do not ever put your mother's name in your mouth," I warned her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "You stood on the porch and smiled while your husband brought a yellow excavator to tear up her rose garden. You nodded your head like an obedient little servant when your racist mother-in-law called our heritage a ghetto aesthetic. You sold your soul, your pride, and your bloodline for a seat at a table where those people will never ever let you eat." "Dad, no, please," she begged, but I cut her off completely. "When you stood there and watched them throw my life into the rain, I did not see anyone holding a gun to your head. I did not see anyone forcing you. You made a choice. You chose your husband. You chose his entitled, pathetic family. You chose their side of the street. Now you get to help them pay the toll. Do not call this number ever again." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting the line. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table. The silence in my hotel room returned thick and absolute. I felt no guilt. I felt no regret. I only felt the profound, necessary peace of removing a cancerous tumor from my life. I picked up my wireless earpiece from the table and slipped it into my ear. I had left the audio surveillance feed running in my former house. I wanted to know exactly how the enemy camp was reacting to the final closure of their escape route. Through the earpiece, I heard the dull thud of Maya dropping her phone onto the hardwood floor. She let out a long, agonizing scream of pure defeat. It was the sound of reality completely crushing her delusions. "What did he say?" Chad's voice demanded. He sounded frantic, breathless, like a cornered animal. "Tell me he is calling off the city mandate. Tell me he is giving us the money. He hung up on me." Maya cried, her voice muffled as if she had buried her face in her hands. "He does not care, Chad. He is not going to stop. We are dead. We are financially dead. We have to pack our things. We have to leave before the bulldozers get here." I heard the sound of glass shattering. Chad had picked up a heavy crystal decanter and hurled it against the stone fireplace. His fragile, unearned ego had completely shattered. He could not handle the fact that he had been outsmarted by the very man he considered beneath him. When entitled men realize their intelligence is a fraud, they always resort to violence. "I am not letting some stubborn old black man ruin my entire life," Chad roared, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of panic and uncontrollable racist fury. "I am not losing my firm. I am not letting my parents become homeless because of his stupid legal tricks." "Chad, stop it," Maya pleaded. "There is nothing we can do. The lawyer said the paperwork is bulletproof. He owns the land." "I do not care about the paperwork," Chad screamed. "I know where he is. I heard him tell the taxi driver the night I kicked him out. He went to the downtown Marriott. I know the general manager at that hotel. I am going down there right now. I am going to find his room. I will drag him by his collar to the city planning office tomorrow morning and make him sign a reversal. He is just a weak, pathetic old man. I will break his jaw if I have to. I heard the heavy, rapid footsteps of Chad stomping toward the front door. I heard the deadbolt click open and the door slam shut with enough force to shake the walls. He was coming. I sat in my luxurious penthouse suite looking out at the city lights. I did not feel a single drop of fear. Chad thought he was hunting a helpless old man. He thought physical intimidation would magically erase the legal execution I had orchestrated. I stood up slowly, leaning my weight onto my polished wooden cane. I walked over to the suite's private landline and dialed the front desk. I did not call the police. That would be too easy. I wanted Chad to walk right into the lobby. I wanted him to attempt his little display of dominance, because a predator who relies on blind rage is the easiest thing in the world to trap. Let him come. I was ready. I did not stay in my penthouse suite to wait for Chad. If you know a violent storm is heading directly for your house, you do not hide up in the attic. You go down to the foundation to watch it break against the concrete. I took the private elevator down to the grand lobby of the Marriott. It was past midnight. The lobby was a masterpiece of quiet, intimidating luxury. Soft amber lighting reflected off the polished marble floors, and the air carried the faint, rich smell of expensive leather and citrus. I chose a high-backed mahogany armchair near the center of the room, positioning myself directly in the line of sight from the revolving glass entrance doors. I ordered a dark black coffee from the night concierge. Then I made one very specific phone call to the chief of hotel security. He was a retired Chicago police captain I had worked alongside on several complex city zoning projects a decade ago. We had a mutual respect built on years of navigating city corruption. I told him a very desperate, very angry man was about to breach his lobby with the intention of doing me physical harm. I asked him for a small favor. He was more than happy to oblige. I also knew there were 2 plainclothes undercover officers finishing their shift at the hotel lounge. The timing was absolutely flawless. I sat there sipping my coffee, the porcelain cup warm against my calloused hands. I tapped my fingers in a slow, steady rhythm on the armrest. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass revolving doors were shoved violently out of their tracks. Chad burst into the lobby. He looked absolutely deranged. The slick, arrogant real estate broker who had thrown my luggage into the freezing rain just a few hours ago was completely gone. His expensive tailored suit was totally soaked, clinging to his body like a wet trash bag. His slicked back hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping muddy water onto the immaculate marble. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked exactly like a cornered rat who had just realized the steel trap had snapped shut over his tail. He frantically scanned the massive lobby, completely ignoring the startled nightstaff and the few late-night guests. Then his wild, desperate eyes locked onto me. He marched across the pristine floor, his wet leather shoes squeaking loudly, leaving a pathetic trail of dirty water in his wake. His fists were clenched tight at his sides. He actually thought he was intimidating. He genuinely believed that his youth, his blind rage, and his sheer entitlement gave him the upper hand. He thought the rules of his privileged life applied everywhere he went, even in a room where he was clearly outmatched. He stopped right in front of my chair, trying to tower over me. I did not flinch. I did not look up immediately. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the rich, dark warmth slide down my throat. "You son of a bitch," Chad hissed. His voice was trembling with a toxic cocktail of panic and raw, unfiltered, racist fury. "You think you are so smart. You think you can outplay me. I am going to ruin you. I am going to make sure you die penniless in a state-run facility. You are nothing but an old, uneducated thug who got lucky. You are going to call the city right now and undo this land sale. You are going to sign that dirt over to my firm, or I swear to God I will beat you within an inch of your life." I slowly placed my coffee cup down on the saucer. The porcelain clinked softly in the tense silence of the lobby. I looked up at him. He was physically shaking. His entire body was vibrating with the horrific realization that he was totally and completely powerless. "You are dripping muddy water on a very expensive rug, Chad," I said. My voice was perfectly level, barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I highly suggest you lower your voice and walk back out those doors before you make a mistake you cannot afford to pay for." Chad lost whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. His fragile, privileged ego simply could not process the reality of an old black man speaking to him with such calm, dismissive command. He lunged forward. He slammed both of his hands down onto my side table, knocking my coffee cup over, sending the dark liquid spilling across the polished wood. "Listen to me, you arrogant old." He started to scream, leaning his face just inches from mine, spit flying from his lips as he prepared to grab the collar of my coat. He never got to finish his sentence. I did not even have to lift my wooden cane. Before Chad could physically touch me, 3 massive figures materialized from the shadows of the lobby pillars. The retired police captain and the 2 undercover officers hit Chad with the unstoppable force of a freight train. They grabbed his arms, twisted them violently behind his back, and slammed him face first into the freezing marble floor. The impact echoed like a gunshot through the quiet lobby. Chad screamed in shock and sudden pain as a heavy knee was planted firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground. "Let me go. Do you know who I am? Get your hands off me, you cannot do this," he shrieked, thrashing his legs against the marble like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. "Sir, you are under arrest for assault, trespassing, and making terroristic threats." One of the undercover officers barked, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around Chad's wrists with a sharp, satisfying click. "You have the right to remain silent, and considering the hole you are digging for yourself, I highly suggest you use it." I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I leaned my weight onto my polished cane and walked over to where Chad was pinned against the floor. His cheek was pressed hard against the cold stone. He was gasping for air, looking up at me with eyes that finally truly understood the concept of absolute, inescapable defeat. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from his ear. My voice was a dark, rumbling gravel. "You think just because you are a white man in a tailored suit, you can walk into my life and steal what is mine?" I whispered, ensuring only he could hear the absolute finality in my words. "You thought your skin color and your real estate license made you a predator and made me the prey. But you picked the wrong generation to mess with boy. I survived wolves 100 times smarter and 1,000 times more dangerous than you. Now you are going to bleed out in a cage." I stood back up, adjusting my coat. I nodded to the security chief, silently thanking him for his prompt service. The officers hauled Chad to his feet. He was no longer shouting. He was whimpering. All the fake alpha energy had been completely drained out of him, leaving nothing but a pathetic, broken shell of a man. They marched him through the lobby, his wet shoes dragging across the floor right out the revolving glass doors and into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The red and blue lights painted the rainy street in flashing neon. I watched the cruiser speed away into the dark city. I sat back down in a fresh chair and signaled the waiter for another cup of coffee. Chad was going to spend the night shivering in a concrete holding cell. But the real beauty of this arrest was not just the physical humiliation. It was the devastating financial bleed that was about to follow. A felony assault charge and a terroristic threat charge required a massive bail bond. Maya was currently sitting in the house I owned the land under, watching her entire fake empire collapse. In a few hours, she was going to get a desperate phone call from the county jail. She was going to have to drain the absolute last remaining pennies from their shared accounts. She would probably have to pawn her expensive wedding ring and sell her designer bags just to scrape together the 10% needed for a bail bondsman. They were already suffocating under a mountain of bad credit. They were staring down the barrel of a $15,000 retroactive rent demand and a $150,000 city demolition fee. This sudden bail money requirement was going to completely break their bank. They were about to learn what true, inescapable poverty felt like, and my legal onslaught was not even close to being finished. Chad walked out of the county jail the next morning looking like a drowned rat. I knew this because I had my private investigator parked across the street from the precinct sending me live updates. Maya had to drain the absolute last of their joint savings and pawn her diamond wedding ring just to secure the bond. Chad had spent 12 hours in a freezing concrete holding cell surrounded by the exact type of people he usually crossed the street to avoid. His tailored suit was ruined, his arrogance was severely bruised, but his nightmare was only just beginning. While Chad was sitting in a jail cell shivering, I was sitting in my penthouse suite looking over his financial portfolio. 5 years ago, when Chad was a struggling junior broker drowning in law school debt and desperately needing seed money to start his own firm, every major bank in Chicago laughed him out of their lobbies. He had a terrible credit history and zero collateral. But miraculously, a private boutique lending firm approved him for a $250,000 consolidated business and student loan. For 5 years, Chad bragged at country club dinners about his incredible negotiation skills. He told everyone how he charmed a private equity firm into backing his vision. He thought he was a financial genius. He never bothered to look up the parent company of that boutique lending firm. If he had, he would have discovered that it was a holding trust fully funded and controlled by me. I was his bank. I was his silent benefactor. I approved the loan because he was marrying my daughter and I wanted to ensure she had a stable future. But I am not a fool and I do not write blank checks without safety nets. Every commercial contract I draft comes with very specific covenants. I picked up my phone and called Graham. The morning sun was shining brightly over Chicago, a beautiful contrast to the absolute darkness I was about to drop on my son-in-law. "Graham," I said, taking a sip of my dark coffee. "Chad was arrested last night for a violent felony and making terroristic threats. I believe that triggers the moral turpitude and criminal liability default clauses in his commercial loan agreements." I could hear the smile in Graham's voice. "It absolutely does, Vince. A felony arrest constitutes a material breach of contract. The grace period is effectively voided. The entire outstanding balance of $212,000 is due immediately in full. Execute the default, Graham," I instructed coldly. "Freeze his operating accounts, garnish his business lines, choke him out. Consider it done, Vince." Less than an hour later, I placed my wireless earpiece in my right ear. The audio feed from the house was still crystal clear. I listened to the exact moment the financial guillotine dropped on Chad's neck. He was yelling at a bank representative on speakerphone in the kitchen. His voice was shrill, cracking with absolute hysteria. "What do you mean my accounts are frozen?" he screamed. "All of them. That is my business operating account. I have payroll tomorrow. You cannot just lock my assets without warning." The bank representative sounded completely indifferent, delivering the corporate equivalent of a death sentence. "Sir, we received a court-authorized garnishment and freeze order from your primary creditor due to a severe breach of contract. Your criminal arrest last night triggered a default. Your balance is currently negative $212,000. Any incoming funds will be automatically seized until the debt is satisfied. Have a good day." The dial tone echoed through the massive kitchen. I heard Chad drop his phone. I heard his heavy, panicked breathing. "What is happening?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. "Chad, what did the bank say?" "He ruined me," Chad gasped, hyperventilating. "He was the lender. Your father was the private equity firm. He owned my business loans. He owned my student debt. He just called it all in. My accounts are locked. My credit cards are declining. I have absolutely nothing. We are completely broke, Maya. We do not have a single dollar to our names." The mansion was no longer a safe haven. It was a giant, expensive wooden box scheduled for demolition in 6 days. The city mandate was ticking down. With Chad's accounts completely frozen, the grand illusion of their upper-class wealth evaporated into thin air. This financial collapse triggered an immediate and vicious chain reaction. Richard and Beatrice, Chad's pretentious parents, were suddenly facing the brutal reality of their own foolishness. They had sold their modest suburban condo and handed all their equity over to Chad to help him leverage my property. Now that money was trapped inside frozen bank accounts, swallowed whole by the debt Chad owed to me, they had to pack their things. They could not stay in a house that was legally mandated for destruction, and Chad could not even afford to buy them a cup of coffee, let alone a room at a luxury hotel. I listened through the earpiece as the scene unfolded in the grand foyer. It was the most satisfying and heartbreaking audio I had ever heard. Satisfying because the arrogant invaders were being violently expelled. Heartbreaking because my daughter was finally seeing the true face of the family she had chosen over her own father. Richard and Beatrice were hauling heavy garbage bags filled with their expensive designer clothes down the grand staircase. They had no suitcases large enough for a sudden eviction. The wealthy, refined socialites who had looked at my mahogany walls and called them ghetto were now stuffing their silk shirts into black plastic trash bags. They were waiting for a cheap budget taxi to take them to a rundown, roach-infested motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. Beatrice was weeping, but it was not tears of sadness. It was tears of pure, venomous rage. And because Chad was her golden boy, she aimed all of her vicious hatred directly at the only available target. My daughter. "This is all your fault," Beatrice hissed at Maya. Her voice was sharp and cruel, completely stripped of any polite society manners. "You and your vindictive, evil father. We welcomed you into our civilized family, and you brought us nothing but a curse." Maya sounded shocked, her voice small and broken. "Beatrice, please. I did not know he was going to do this. I lost everything too. You lost nothing because you are nothing, Richard barked, stepping forward to back up his wife. You come from a family of deceitful, manipulative thugs. We should have never let our son marry someone from your background. You are bad luck. You are absolute trash, Maya. You dragged our successful son down into the gutter with you. I gripped the armrest of my leather chair. My blood boiled. They were showing their true ugly racist colors. They never loved Maya. They only tolerated her because they thought she came with a massive inheritance they could eventually absorb. Without my money to act as a shield, Maya was nothing to them but an unwanted outsider. I waited for Chad to speak up. I waited for the man who took vows to protect and honor my daughter to step between her and his abusive parents. I waited for him to defend his wife, but Chad did not say a single word. He stood there in silence. He let his parents verbally destroy the woman he claimed to love. He let them hurl racist insults and blame her for a catastrophe he had entirely engineered with his own greed. He was a coward. He was a weak, pathetic boy who only cared about his own survival. "Mom, Dad, the taxi is here," Chad finally mumbled, completely ignoring the tears streaming down his wife's face. "I will call you when I figure this out." The front door slammed shut. Richard and Beatrice were gone, exiled to a cheap motel with nothing but garbage bags. Inside the quiet house, I heard Maya drop to her knees. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the deep, agonizing cries of a woman whose entire reality had just been shattered into a million pieces. She realized in that exact moment that her husband's family completely despised her. She realized that the people she had betrayed her own father for viewed her as nothing more than a racial stereotype and a financial stepping stone. She had burned down her own sanctuary to build a house on their toxic foundation, and now she was buried under the rubble. The illusion was dead, the money was gone, and Maya was entirely terrifyingly alone. The knock on my hotel room door was not loud. It was not the aggressive, demanding pounding of a man like Chad. It was a weak, trembling flutter against the heavy wood, the sound of someone who had absolutely nothing left. I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window watching the city lights of Chicago flicker in the cold night. I placed my coffee cup on the table and walked slowly toward the entrance. I did not need to look through the peephole to know who was standing out there in the hallway. I could feel it in my bones. I turned the brass lock and pulled the door open. Maya was standing there, but she looked completely unrecognizable. The polished, pristine woman who had worn a tight designer dress and a perfect, arrogant smile at the housewarming party was entirely gone. Her hair was a messy, tangled knot. Her expensive coat was wrinkled and soaked from the rain. Her face was pale, her eyes red and severely swollen from hours of crying. She looked exactly like a survivor who had just crawled out of a devastating car crash. As soon as she saw my face, her knees simply gave out. She collapsed right there in the carpeted hallway of the hotel, dropping to the floor in front of me. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep with a raw, agonizing sound that tore directly at my chest. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking and breaking into a million pieces. "Dad, please. I am so sorry. Please help me." I looked down at my only child. The daughter Vivian and I had prayed for the little girl I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. My heart physically ached. Every instinct I possessed as a father screamed at me to reach down, pull her off the floor, wrap my arms around her, and tell her that everything was going to be fine. I had the power to make it all go away. With one phone call to Graham and one wire transfer, I could wipe out the debt, stop the demolition, and save her from this absolute misery. But I remembered the yellow excavator tearing through her mother's rose garden. I remembered the cold, blank stare she gave me when Chad kicked my duffel bag out into the freezing storm. I remembered her nodding along eagerly when Beatrice called our home ghetto. If I reached down and saved her right now, I would be saving a parasite. I would be teaching her that betrayal has no real consequences as long as you can cry hard enough when you get caught. I did not reach out my hand. I stood tall, resting my weight on my wooden cane, and looked down at her. "What happened, Maya?" I asked, my voice steady, deep, and utterly devoid of comfort. She looked up at me, her face shining with tears. "Chad left me," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. After his parents took a taxi to a motel, he completely lost his mind. He started throwing things. He screamed that I ruined his life. He packed a suitcase and walked out the door. He told me he is filing for an emergency divorce first thing tomorrow morning. I let out a slow, quiet breath. It was exactly the cowardly move I expected from a man like him. He thinks he can escape the debt I stated simply. He thinks if he divorces you, he can claim you committed fraud against him by hiding my ground lease, and he can dump the demolition fees and the frozen loan accounts entirely onto your name. He thinks he can leave you holding the bag. Maya nodded frantically, her hands gripping the bottom of my trousers. Yes, that is exactly what he said. He said he is going to tell the judge that I manipulated him into taking the deed. He said he is going to leave me with absolutely nothing. Dad, I have no money. My accounts are tied to his, and the bank locked them all. I do not have a place to sleep tonight. The house is freezing because the utility companies cut the power. Please, Dad. I was stupid. I was so stupid. Just let me come inside. Let me stay with you. I will do whatever you want. I will leave him forever. I looked at her desperate, pleading eyes. It was the hardest moment of my entire 72 years on this earth. Harder than pouring concrete in the freezing winters. Harder than burying my beautiful Vivian. Because right now, I had to deliberately break my daughter's heart in order to save her soul. I gently but firmly stepped back, pulling the fabric of my trousers out of her desperate grip. I raised you to be an educated, strong, independent woman, Maya, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet hotel corridor. Your mother and I gave you every tool you needed to build a beautiful life. But instead of building your own house, you decided to steal mine. You sold your soul to a man and a family who looked down on you. You traded your heritage, your pride, and your own father for the shallow approval of people who absolutely despise your roots. Dad, please, I know, she cried, reaching out for me again. I did not stop speaking. You stood in that grand foyer and smiled while they mocked the blood and sweat that paid for your private schools. You let them erase your mother's memory just to fit into their miserable, pretentious world. They saw you as a convenient stepping stone to get to my assets. And now that the stone is broken, they are tossing you into the garbage. I watched the devastating truth of my words sink into her chest. She stopped reaching for me. She just kneeled there weeping, crushed by the absolute reality of her situation. You came here tonight because you want me to be your safety net. I continued, my tone lowering into a sad, heavy whisper. But I cannot save you from the life you voluntarily chose, Maya. If I bail you out of this, you will never understand the true cost of your betrayal. You will never learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. You have to face this storm alone. You have to feel the cold. You have to fight your own way out of the corner you painted yourself into. This is a lesson you must learn by yourself. Dad, where am I supposed to go? She whispered, her voice totally defeated. I have nothing. You have an education, I replied coldly. You have a brain. You will find a cheap motel or a women's shelter for the night. You will get a job. You will hire a public defender to fight Chad in divorce court. You will start over from absolute zero, just like your mother and I did 50 years ago. And maybe when you finally figure out who you really are and not who Chad Preston wanted you to be, we can have a conversation. I took a step back into my hotel room. Good night, Maya. No, wait, Dad. Please do not close the door, she screamed, scrambling forward. I did not hesitate. I gripped the heavy brass handle and pulled the solid wooden door shut. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking echoed with absolute finality. I stood in my room, leaning my forehead against the cold wood of the door, listening to my daughter's sob in the hallway. I closed my eyes, letting a single silent tear roll down my weathered cheek. It was brutal. It was agonizing. But it was the only way she would ever survive the real world. I walked away from the door and turned off the lights. Time moves strangely when you are waiting for a long overdue execution. The next few days passed in a blur of legal updates and quiet anticipation. Chad did exactly what he promised. He filed for an emergency divorce, desperately trying to sever his assets from Maya before the city of Chicago brought down the hammer. But Graham was 10 steps ahead of his cheap public defender. Graham had already attached the business loan default and the retroactive land rent directly to Chad's primary social security number and his commercial broker license. There was no escape. Chad was chained to the sinking ship and the water was rising fast. Then the 7th day finally arrived. I woke up before dawn. The Chicago morning was freezing, draped in a thick gray winter fog. I put on my heavy wool coat, grabbed my wooden cane, and left the hotel. I did not take a taxi this time. I walked. I wanted to feel the cold air in my lungs. I wanted to walk the same streets I had walked when I was a young contractor building a life from nothing. I reached the corner of my old neighborhood just as the sun began to peek through the heavy gray clouds. The street was quiet, but it was not empty. A deep mechanical rumble vibrated through the asphalt beneath my boots. It was a sound I knew very well, the sound of heavy industrial diesel engines. I looked down the block. The city of Chicago was not bluffing. They never bluff when a multi-billion-dollar highway project is on the line. A massive convoy of yellow municipal machinery was rolling slowly down the street. There were 2 heavy-duty excavators, a massive wrecking ball crane, and a fleet of empty dump trucks waiting to haul away the debris. Flashing amber lights cut through the morning fog, painting the neighborhood in a rhythmic warning glow. The demolition crew had arrived. The 30-day mandate had officially expired. Chad Preston had failed to move the physical structure off city property. The grace period was over. I stood on the sidewalk leaning on my cane and watched the massive yellow machines turn their heavy metal tracks, positioning themselves directly in front of the custom wood and stone sanctuary I had built 50 years ago. The final act of absolute destruction was about to begin. I did not walk the rest of the way to the house. I had a car waiting for me 2 blocks down the street. It was a brand new jet black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. I had walked into the dealership 2 days ago and paid for it entirely in cash using a tiny fraction of the $4 million the city of Chicago had wired directly into my private holding account. I slid into the driver's seat, feeling the soft heated leather against my aching back. I drove slowly, letting the powerful engine purr as I pulled up right across the street from the property line. I put the car in park and rolled down the tinted window. The crisp winter air filled the cabin, but I was perfectly warm. I rested my arm on the doorframe and watched the grand finale of the trap I had set. The massive yellow bulldozers and the wrecking ball crane were already idling at the curb. Their heavy diesel engines rumbled like hungry beasts, sending thick plumes of white exhaust into the freezing morning fog. A team of city contractors in neon safety vests and hard hats stood by the property line holding clipboards and drinking coffee from thermos flasks. They were just waiting for the official green light. The 30-day clearance mandate had officially expired at midnight. The grace period was dead. And then there was the Preston family, the wealthy, cultured, refined white socialites who had looked at my custom mahogany walls and called them ghetto. The people who had tried to erase my legacy so they could build a swimming pool. Today they were not sipping expensive bourbon on my leather sofa. Today they were doing manual labor in the freezing mud. I watched Richard Chad's father, his face purple and sweating profusely in the bitter cold. He was struggling to carry a heavy taped-up cardboard box down the front steps. He stumbled over his own feet, almost dropping the box into the dirt. Beatrice was right behind him. Her pristine designer hair was tied up in a messy, frantic bun. She was wearing a pair of dirty gray sweatpants, dragging heavy black plastic garbage bags filled with their belongings across the driveway. They had rented a cheap, beaten-up U-Haul truck that was parked haphazardly near the sidewalk. The luxury vehicles Chad had leased to impress his investors were completely gone. The moment his business accounts were frozen and his loans defaulted, the banks had swooped in and repossessed every single car. Now these arrogant people who thought they were royalty were forced to load their entire lives into the back of a rented moving van. Chad ran out of the front door carrying a stack of framed photographs and a desk lamp. He looked like a walking corpse. His eyes were deeply sunken, his skin was pale and sickly, and he had not shaved in days. He was frantically yelling at his parents to move faster. The panic radiating from him was palpable even from across the street. He knew the clock had run out. I sat in the comfort of my Mercedes watching them scramble. There is a very specific type of poetry in watching arrogant people carry the absolute weight of their own consequences. They thought their skin color and their perceived status made them invincible. They thought they could just push an old black man out into the freezing rain and steal the fruits of his 50 years of labor. Now they were the ones being thrown out, stuffing their stolen dreams into cheap cardboard boxes while the city machinery waited to crush their castle. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the site foreman for the city of Chicago checked his watch. He nodded to his demolition crew. He walked past the idling excavators, stepped over the ruined remains of Vivian's rose garden, and walked straight up the driveway toward the U-Haul truck. Chad dropped a box of kitchenware into the back of the van and turned around his chest, heaving with exhaustion. "Excuse me," the foreman said, his voice loud, carrying clearly across the quiet street. "Are you Chadwick Preston?" "Yes, that is me," Chad gasped, holding up his hands in a desperate plea. Please, we just need another hour. We are getting the last of our things out of the living room. Just give us one more hour. You do not have an hour, Mr. Preston, the foreman said with zero sympathy. The eviction mandate expired at midnight. This property is now an active municipal demolition zone. You need to clear the premises immediately for your own safety. If you go back inside that structure, I will have the police remove you for trespassing on a state construction site. Beatrice dropped a garbage bag into the mud and ran over, grabbing Chad by the arm. Chad, do something. Tell them they cannot do this. We still have antique furniture inside. We have to get our things. The foreman pulled a bright pink carbon copy invoice from his heavy metal clipboard. He did not care about their antique furniture. He was a city worker doing his job, executing the very laws I had helped write decades ago. He handed the pink paper directly to Chad. Mr. Preston, as the legally registered owner of the physical structure that is currently in violation of the municipal clearance mandate, you are hereby served with the official demolition and debris removal invoice. Chad took the pink paper with trembling hands. I watched his wild eyes scan the printed numbers. I knew exactly what that piece of paper said. The base demolition fee, the hazardous material disposal fee, the heavy machinery operating costs, and the severe municipal penalty for failing to relocate a residential structure from city property. The grand total printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the page was $152,400, payable to the city of Chicago within 30 days, or it would be immediately sent to federal collections and attached as a permanent lien against any and all future earnings. It was the final lethal bullet to his financial heart. Chad's knees literally gave out beneath him. He collapsed against the back bumper of the rusted U-Haul truck, sliding down the metal until he was sitting in the freezing cold mud of the driveway. The pink invoice slipped from his lifeless fingers and fluttered onto the wet ground. He grabbed his hair, pulling violently at the roots, and let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. It was the agonizing sound of a man whose entire existence had just been vaporized into nothing. Richard scrambled forward and snatched the paper from the mud. He read the total amount and physically staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. Beatrice looked over his shoulder, saw the massive debt her golden boy had just inherited, and began to wail. It was a loud, ugly, high-pitched sound of total despair that echoed down the entire street. They were completely and utterly ruined. They had no home, no money, no credit, and now they owed the municipal government a small fortune just to clean up the mess of their own greed. I sat in the heated leather seat of my Mercedes, watching the architects of my attempted destruction weep in the dirt. I did not feel a single drop of pity. Pity is reserved for victims of circumstance. Chad and his family were victims of their own monumental, blinding arrogance. They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was the one who poured the concrete. I reached forward and pressed a button on the door panel. The tinted window rolled up silently, instantly cutting off the sound of their pathetic crying. I shifted the car into drive. I had a brand new life to begin, and I did not need to stick around to watch the wrecking ball swing. As I drove away smoothly down the street, the heavy diesel excavators roared to life behind me, raising their massive steel buckets into the air, ready to turn Chad Preston's stolen mansion into a pile of worthless splinters. I did not drive far. I parked my brand new Mercedes 2 blocks away on a slight incline that gave me a clear and unobstructed view of the property line. I left the engine running, letting the soft hum of the heater keep the freezing Chicago morning at bay. I rolled the tinted window down just an inch. I wanted to feel the cold air on my face. I wanted to hear it. I needed to hear it. The heavy diesel engines of the city excavators roared to life, shaking the cold air and vibrating through the asphalt all the way to my car tires. The wrecking ball crane positioned itself in the center of the ruined lawn. The massive steel sphere hung suspended for a fraction of a second against the heavy gray sky before gravity and raw mechanical power pulled it forward. The heavy iron slammed directly into the front facade of the house. The sound was absolutely deafening. It was a violent, thunderous crack of splintering timber and shattering brick that echoed down the entire street. The custom mahogany archways that I had painstakingly carved and sanded by hand folded inwards like cheap wet cardboard. The beautiful southern bay windows, the exact spot where Vivian used to sit wrapped in her favorite blanket to watch her roses bloom, shattered into thousands of tiny, glittering pieces that rained down onto the freezing mud. The yellow excavators moved in immediately after the first strike. Their heavy steel buckets tore the roof apart, ripping violently through the Brazilian walnut floors. Those were the exact same floors Chad had stood on while he arrogantly threw my luggage into the freezing rain just days ago. As I watched the walls cave in, a sudden sharp ache bloomed in the center of my chest. It was not regret, and it was not second-guessing, but it was a profound, heavy sorrow. You cannot build a sanctuary with your own two bare hands, pour your literal blood and sweat into the foundation, and watch it be pulverized into dust without feeling the shockwaves rattle your own bones. I saw the eastern wall of the living room collapse into a massive cloud of white drywall and broken splinters. That was the wall where Vivian and I used to measure Maya as she grew up. I vividly remembered taking a small pencil and making tiny hopeful marks on that specific doorframe every single birthday. I remembered the smell of Vivian baking sweet potato pie in the kitchen that was currently being crushed by a 30-ton machine. I remembered carrying her across that very threshold on the day we finally finished the construction. We were young, black, and exhausted, but we were incredibly proud. We had built a fortress of love in a world that constantly tried to tear us down. For a moment, the thick dust cloud rising from the rubble looked like a ghost of the life I had lost. My calloused hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned ash gray. I was watching 50 years of my personal history being violently erased from the face of the earth. The home where I had experienced my greatest joys and my deepest, most agonizing grief was turning into a pile of worthless debris before my eyes. But the moment of grief passed as quickly as the bitter winter wind blowing through the crack in my window. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs and clear my mind. I looked at the broken timber and the shattered bricks being scooped up by the machines, and I realized a fundamental, undeniable truth. The house was not my history. The house was not Vivian. The house was just wood, stone, glass, and metal. The true living soul of that home was the absolute unconditional love my wife and I had shared inside those walls for decades. And that soul had been violently evicted the exact moment Maya stood by with her arms crossed and watched her arrogant husband throw me out into the dark. The sanctuary had been completely tainted the second Beatrice and Richard Preston walked through the front door and called our heritage ghetto. They had infected the sacred space with their racism, their blind entitlement, and their bottomless parasitic greed. Leaving the house standing with them inside it would have been the ultimate disrespect to Vivian's memory. It would have been a monument to their theft. Watching the heavy municipal machinery grind the structure into absolute nothingness was not a destruction of my past. It was a cleansing. I was burning the infected crop to save the soil underneath. The memories of my beautiful wife were safe inside my heart, completely untouchable by the likes of Chad Preston or his horrific parents. They could never steal what Vivian and I had built because the real foundation was not made of concrete. It was made of loyalty, something they knew absolutely nothing about. Let them have the dust. I sat in the quiet luxury of my car until the roof completely caved in and the house was reduced to nothing but a flat, chaotic mountain of trash. The city contractors were already moving the massive dump trucks into position to haul the debris away. The physical evidence of Chad's massive failure was being scraped off the earth, leaving him with nothing but a devastating municipal demolition bill. My phone buzzed in the center console, breaking the steady rhythm of the diesel engines outside. It was a secure priority notification from my offshore private banking application. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. The $4 million wire transfer from the City of Chicago Department of City Planning had officially cleared the final escrow hold. The funds were fully deposited, liquid, and immediately available in my primary holding account. I stared at the massive string of numbers glowing on the screen. $4 million in pure cash. Added to the considerable wealth I had already accumulated and hidden over my 40-year career, it was a weapon of absolute, untouchable freedom. Chad and his pathetic family were currently standing in the mud somewhere on the other side of town, completely broke, homeless, and drowning in a $150,000 demolition debt that would garnish their wages for the rest of their miserable lives. Maya was out there wandering the city alone, desperately learning the brutal, freezing cost of her betrayal. But me, I was sitting in a heated leather seat with a completely clean slate and a fresh fortune in the bank. The heavy burden of the past had been literally demolished, paving the way for a brand new future. I did not want to just sit on this money. I did not want to quietly fade away into retirement like society expects old men to do. I had survived the worst betrayal a father could possibly endure, and I had come out the other side infinitely stronger. I had a very specific, very grand plan for exactly how I was going to spend this new fortune. A plan that would honor Vivian's true legacy and ensure that our name meant something powerful long after the dust from this demolition settled. I put the car in drive, the engine responding with a smooth, powerful purr. I did not look back in the rearview mirror at the empty lot. I rolled the window up, sealing out the noise of the wrecking ball, and drove away from the wreckage, steering my car straight toward the heart of downtown Chicago. Chad Preston was a rat on a sinking ship, and rats always look for the quickest way off, even if it means drowning whoever is standing next to them. Just 48 hours after the city of Chicago turned his stolen mansion into a pile of worthless splinters, Chad marched into the county courthouse and filed an emergency petition for divorce. He wanted to sever all legal ties to my daughter before the financial shockwaves completely shattered his life. In his desperate, cowardly mind, he thought he could use the family court system to escape the massive debts closing in on him. He planned to argue that Maya had deliberately deceived him about the ground lease, hoping a sympathetic judge would dump the $150,000 demolition fee and the defaulted business loan squarely onto her shoulders. He wanted to leave her holding the bag while he walked away clean. But Chad severely underestimated the man playing chess against him. He was playing checkers while my lawyer Graham was already 3 checkmates ahead. When you spend decades building commercial structures, you learn to reinforce the load-bearing walls before the storm even hits. I had instructed Graham to anticipate Chad's cowardice from the very beginning. Before Chad even printed the divorce papers, Graham had already legally pinned every single ounce of that debt directly to Chad's primary Social Security number and his specific commercial real estate broker license. The structural deed he signed on my dining room table was not a joint marital asset. Graham had carefully structured the transfer so that Chad assumed the primary liability as the licensed professional overseeing the transaction. When Chad stood before the divorce judge, his cheap public defender tried to argue that the municipal fines and the private equity default should be split evenly or shifted entirely to Maya. The judge took one look at the ironclad documents Graham had filed with the county clerk. The judge practically laughed in his face. The court ruled that Chad, as a licensed real estate broker, was solely responsible for his failure to perform basic due diligence. The debt was entirely his. The divorce was granted, but the financial chains remained locked tightly around Chad's ankles. The collapse of Chad Preston was swift, brutal, and absolutely spectacular to witness. The city of Chicago does not play games when it comes to unpaid municipal fines. When Chad failed to produce the $150,000 for the demolition, the city immediately placed a massive lien on his brokerage firm. At the exact same time, my holding company seized the remaining assets from his defaulted business loan. The double impact completely obliterated his company. His office doors were padlocked, his remaining junior agents abandoned him. But the real death blow came from the state licensing board. Because Chad had been found grossly negligent in a major real estate transaction, and because his business was currently being dismantled by federal and municipal creditors, the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation launched an immediate investigation. They did not just suspend his broker license, they revoked it permanently. The arrogant man who loved to brag at country club dinners about his brilliant acquisition strategies was officially banned from ever selling a single piece of real estate in the state again. He lost his company. He lost his license. He lost his entire identity. With no income and a mountain of insurmountable debt, Chad had no choice but to walk into a federal courthouse and declare absolute personal bankruptcy. He was reduced to nothing. The alpha male was dead buried under the rubble of his own greed. And what about Maya, the daughter who stood by and watched her husband throw me into the freezing rain? She walked away from the divorce with exactly what she brought into it. Nothing. She had traded the unconditional love and security of her father for the illusion of high society status, and now that illusion had evaporated. Without my money to fund her lifestyle and without Chad's credit cards to lean on, Maya was violently thrust into the real world. She had to rent a tiny, cramped room in a rundown apartment building on the south side of the city. The woman who used to complain about the vintage aesthetic of my custom-built home was now sharing a single bathroom with 3 strangers. To pay her rent and buy groceries, she had to take a job working the double shift at a busy, greasy diner downtown. She spent her days on her feet carrying heavy trays of food, wearing a polyester uniform that smelled like fried oil. She was finally learning the brutal, exhausting value of a single dollar. She was learning how to survive the hard way. I drove past that diner once in my new Mercedes. I parked across the street and watched her wipe down a dirty table, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. My heart ached, but I did not stop. The lesson had to run its course. But the most poetic, the most satisfying twist in this entire saga did not even come from me. It came from the very people who had looked down on my heritage and called my home a ghetto. Richard and Beatrice Preston. They had sold their modest suburban condo and handed every single penny of their life savings to Chad to help him secure my property. They expected to live out their golden years in a free luxury mansion. Instead, they were currently living in a cheap, roach-infested motel on the industrial outskirts of Chicago, eating microwave dinners and listening to the highway traffic outside their thin window. When they found out that their golden boy had declared personal bankruptcy, the last shred of their civilized high society facade completely melted away. Their retirement equity was gone. It had been swallowed whole by the municipal liens and the loan defaults. Chad had lost their money, and they were staring down the barrel of dying in absolute poverty. Arrogant, greedy people do not possess the capacity for unconditional love. When the money runs out, they turn on each other like starving wolves. Richard and Beatrice did not comfort their ruined son. They did not offer him a shoulder to cry on. Instead, they scraped together the last few dollars they had left and hired a desperate bottom-feeding lawyer. The wealthy, refined white family that had judged my culture and my character so harshly had officially begun to eat itself alive. Richard and Beatrice Preston marched into a civil courthouse and filed a massive lawsuit against their own flesh and blood. They were suing their only son for financial negligence and elder exploitation. The empire was not just destroyed, it was cannibalizing its own remains. The heavy oak doors of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago felt cool and solid under my hand. I pushed them open and stepped into the cavernous marble-lined hallway. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie. My polished wooden cane clicked rhythmically against the stone floor. I walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Beside me walked Graham, my attorney carrying his signature black leather briefcase. Today was the final act, the absolute end of the line for the man who had tried to erase my existence. We were attending the federal bankruptcy hearing for Chadwick Preston. When a man declares personal bankruptcy, he is essentially begging the government to wipe his slate clean. He is asking a federal judge to erase his debts so he can start over. Chad was drowning. He had lost his real estate brokerage. His license was permanently revoked by the state. His parents were actively suing him in civil court for losing their retirement savings. And he was suffocating under the massive weight of the defaulted private equity loan from my holding company plus the $150,000 demolition invoice from the city. But Graham and I were not going to let him walk away with a clean slate. Through a series of brilliant legal maneuvers, Graham had purchased the municipal demolition debt directly from the city of Chicago at a slight discount on behalf of my private limited liability company. We consolidated his debts. That meant I was no longer just the man he evicted. I was legally recognized as his absolute largest creditor. I owned his financial future. We entered the courtroom and took our seats in the heavy wooden pews at the front. The room was quiet, sterile, and completely devoid of warmth. It was a place where dreams went to die on public record. I looked across the aisle and saw Chad. If I had passed him on the street, I genuinely might not have recognized him. The arrogant, slick, high society real estate broker who used to wear designer suits and brag about his wealth was completely gone. The man sitting at the defense table looked like a hollow, broken shell. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that looked like it came from a discount rack. He had lost at least 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, his skin was pale and sickly, and his hands were trembling uncontrollably as they rested on the wooden table. He looked up and met my eyes. The sheer naked terror in his expression was absolute. He quickly looked away, staring down at his hands, completely humiliated. He did not have a high-priced defense shark sitting next to him today. He had a public-appointed bankruptcy attorney who looked bored and completely exhausted. Chad was no longer a big fish. He was just another failed, desperate man begging the court for mercy. The federal judge, an older, stern-looking woman with zero tolerance for nonsense, called the case. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the massive stack of financial documents Graham had submitted to the court. "Mr. Preston," the judge said, her voice echoing sharply through the quiet room, "I am looking at a staggering amount of debt here, but more concerning is the nature of this debt. The primary creditor, Sterling Holdings, has filed a motion to declare these specific debts as non-dischargeable. They have provided extensive documentation proving that these financial liabilities were incurred through gross professional negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and bad faith dealing regarding a property transfer." Chad stood up. His legs were shaking so badly he had to lean on the table to keep himself upright. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice weak and pathetic, "I have absolutely nothing left. I lost my business. I lost my license. I am living in a rented room and working for minimum wage at a hardware supply store. I cannot pay this. If you do not discharge this debt, I will never be able to survive." The judge looked at him coldly. "Bankruptcy is designed to protect honest people who fall on hard times, Mr. Preston. It is not a shield to protect arrogant professionals from the consequences of their own malicious negligence." The judge called for a brief 15-minute recess to review the final addendums Graham had submitted. As the judge stepped out of the room, Chad turned away from his public defender. He looked at me, took a deep, shuddering breath, and slowly walked across the aisle. He stopped 2 feet in front of me. The man who had kicked my canvas duffel bag into the freezing rain, the man who had mocked my blue-collar heritage, was now looking at me with tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "Vince," Chad whispered, his voice cracking horribly, "please, I am begging you." I remained seated. I rested both of my hands on the curved handle of my cane and looked up at him. I did not say a word. I let him stew in his own misery. "I know what I did was wrong," Chad cried, the tears falling freely onto the lapels of his cheap suit. "I was greedy. I was stupid. I was trying to impress my parents and my investors, and I ruined my entire life. I have lost everything, Vince. My wife is gone. My parents hate me. I do not have a career. I do not even have a car. Please, I am begging you as a human being, drop the claim. Withdraw the $150,000 demolition debt. Withdraw the loan default. If the judge attaches this to my record today, my life is completely over. I will be paying you until the day I die. Please just have some mercy." He was openly weeping in a federal courtroom. He had been completely stripped of his pride, his status, and his fake superiority. He was a broken child begging for a lifeline. I looked at his tear-stained face. I thought about Vivian's rose garden being crushed by the excavator. I thought about the way he stood in my living room and laughed at me. I thought about the cold, bitter rain hitting my face the night he locked me out of my own home. I slowly stood up. I straightened my suit jacket, looking him directly in his bloodshot eyes. My voice was deep, calm, and as cold as a Chicago winter. "My mercy," I said, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical blow was thrown out the front door along with my canvas duffel bag that night. "You wanted to play a high-stakes game, Chad. Now you get to pay the entry fee." Chad let out a quiet, devastated sob. He backed away from me, his shoulders completely slumped, carrying the absolute weight of his own destruction. He stumbled back to his table and collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The judge returned to the bench. She picked up her wooden gavel. After reviewing the documents and the evidence of gross negligence, the judge announced, "I am ruling in favor of the primary creditor. The debts owed to Sterling Holdings, including the private equity default and the assumed municipal demolition penalties, are hereby ruled non-dischargeable under federal bankruptcy law." Chad let out a loud, agonizing gasp, but the judge was not finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "To satisfy this massive liability, I am ordering a maximum allowable garnishment of your wages. 30% of every single paycheck you earn from any job you hold will be automatically deducted and transferred to Mr. Sterling's holding company. This garnishment will remain in active effect for the next 20 years, or until the debt is satisfied with interest." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block. The loud crack echoed through the courtroom, sealing Chad Preston's fate forever. He was condemned. For the next 2 decades, every time he mopped a floor, stocked a shelf, or carried a box for minimum wage, he would be working for me. A massive portion of his labor would go directly into my bank account. I had completely indentured him to his own arrogance. I did not stay to watch him cry. I nodded to Graham, turned around, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the grand hallway. I walked out of the federal building and onto the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. The winter clouds had finally broken and bright, brilliant sunlight was washing over the city skyline. The air felt incredibly clean. It tasted like freedom. Every single remnant of the enemy had been completely wiped clean. The arrogant invaders had been crushed, scattered, and permanently chained to their own consequences. The house was gone, but the foundation of my dignity had never been stronger. I had protected my wife's legacy. I had defended my blood, my sweat, and my history. I stood on the sidewalk leaning on my cane and took a deep, satisfying breath. The war was officially over. I had won. And as I walked toward my waiting car, I smiled, ready to finally turn the page and write a brand new chapter. A few weeks after the gavel came down in the federal bankruptcy court, the concierge at the hotel brought a single envelope up to my penthouse suite along with my morning coffee. It was a simple white envelope. There was no return address printed on the corner, but I did not need one. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same careful, slightly slanted script I had taught my daughter to write when she was just a little girl sitting at our kitchen table. I took the envelope and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I stood there for a long time looking out at the freezing waters of Lake Michigan, just feeling the weight of the paper in my calloused hands. Part of me expected it to be another plea for a bailout. Part of me braced for another round of excuses, but when I finally slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the 2 pages of lined notebook paper, I found something entirely different. The letter was written in blue ink, and the paper was warped in several places, stained by dried tears. Maya wrote about her life in the rundown apartment on the south side. She described the lingering smell of fried oil that clung to her uniform even after she washed it. She wrote about how her feet throbbed after working double shifts at the diner, and how she spent her bus rides home staring out the window, realizing exactly what she had thrown away. She did not blame Chad in this letter. She did not blame his racist parents. For the first time in her adult life, Maya took complete and absolute ownership of her own failures. She wrote that she finally understood how completely she had betrayed the blood and sweat her mother and I had poured into her future. She admitted that she had let her own vanity and her desperate desire to fit into a pretentious, hollow society blind her to the absolute cruelty of the people she married into. The most important part of the letter was the final paragraph. She explicitly stated that she was not asking for a single dollar. She did not want me to rescue her from her tiny apartment or her grueling job. She wrote that she needed to feel the exhaustion, she needed to work the terrible shifts because it was the only way she could rebuild the character she had let Chad destroy. She ended the letter by saying she just hoped that one day, before my time on this earth was done, I might be able to look at her and see my daughter again instead of a stranger. I read the letter 3 times. Every paternal instinct I possessed, every protective urge I had cultivated over the last 40 years screamed at me to pick up my phone. I wanted to call her. I wanted to send a car to pick her up, bring her to the hotel, and tell her she was forgiven. My heart physically ached for the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. But I am a man who has spent his entire life studying foundations. If you pour new concrete over wet, unsettled dirt, the entire structure will eventually crack and collapse. Maya was finally digging down to the bedrock. She was finally learning the brutal, undeniable value of hard work and self-reliance. If I stepped in now and handed her a safety net, I would be stealing the most important lesson of her life. I would be undoing the very growth she was fighting so hard to achieve. I did not pick up the phone. I did not write a reply. I carefully folded the 2 pages, walked over to my mahogany desk, and locked the letter inside the top drawer. I forgave her in my heart right then and there. But true redemption requires time. I would let her build her foundation. When the structure was solid, we would talk. But not today. With the past finally settled and the ghosts of my family trauma put to rest, I had a massive amount of capital sitting in my offshore accounts, including the fresh $4 million from the city of Chicago. I was tired of living in a hotel, no matter how luxurious it was. I was a builder. I needed a permanent home. I needed a place that reflected my victory, my survival, and my absolute freedom. I contacted a reputable, highly vetted commercial real estate firm in downtown Chicago. I bypassed the flashy, arrogant brokers and dealt directly with the senior partners. I told them exactly what I wanted, and within a week, I found it. I purchased a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse on the top floor of a high-rise in the South Loop. I paid for it entirely in cash. The transfer was clean, immediate, and absolutely indisputable. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture. It featured massive open spaces, dark hardwood floors that reminded me of my old sanctuary, and floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I stood in the center of my new living room, looking out at the towering skyscrapers, the bridges, and the highways. I had spent 4 decades as an urban planner negotiating zoning laws, inspecting concrete pours, and fighting for community development. I helped shape the very city I was now looking down upon. Chad and his family tried to throw me out into the freezing rain, thinking I was just a tired old man who had outlived his usefulness. Instead, their betrayal had elevated me to the very top of the city. I was standing in the clouds. But a beautiful penthouse is just an empty box if it does not serve a greater purpose. I had secured my peace, but I needed to secure my legacy. I needed to ensure that what Vivian and I had built together would outlast the greed of people like Chad Preston. I invited Graham over to the new penthouse for a celebratory drink and a very serious business meeting. We sat on the massive leather sofas overlooking Lake Michigan, and I outlined my plan. I did not want to just sit on my millions until I died. I wanted to build something that could never be bulldozed, something that no arrogant real estate broker could ever steal. I instructed Graham to take $2 million from my primary holding accounts and establish an irrevocable educational trust. We named it the Vivian Sterling Memorial Scholarship Fund. I wanted to honor the woman who had planted that beautiful rose garden. Since Chad had used heavy machinery to violently erase her flowers from the earth, I decided to plant a garden of human potential that would grow for generations. The trust was specifically designed to provide full-ride comprehensive scholarships for talented underprivileged African American students from the south side of Chicago who wanted to pursue degrees in architecture, civil engineering, and urban planning. I wanted to fund the next generation of black builders. I wanted to give young men and women the tools to understand property law, structural integrity, and commercial development so that they would never be tricked, bullied, or intimidated by the wealthy, privileged sharks of the world. I was going to turn my stolen house into a small army of brilliant architects who would go out and build fortresses of their own. Graham smiled as he took the notes, clearly impressed by the sheer scale of the revenge I was exacting upon the universe. He drafted the legal frameworks, established the board of directors, and ensured that the trust would be completely bulletproof. Vivian's name was going to be engraved on university plaques, spoken in lecture halls, and carried forward by young people doing incredible things. Her legacy was officially immortal. A few weeks later, the trust was fully operational. The penthouse was furnished, and the chaotic storm of the last few months had completely faded into a profound golden silence. I stepped out onto my massive private terrace as the sun began to set over Chicago. The winter air was biting and crisp, but I was wearing a thick, heavy wool coat. I held a crystal glass of my favorite aged bourbon. I leaned my hands against the thick glass railing and looked out over the sprawling, glowing grid of the city streets below. Somewhere down there in the sprawling maze of the city, Chad was sweeping floors or carrying boxes for minimum wage. 30% of his meager paycheck automatically siphoned into my bank account. Somewhere down there, his arrogant parents were sitting in a cheap motel, turning on each other in their absolute poverty. And somewhere down there, Maya was finishing a grueling shift at a greasy diner, learning the hard, beautiful value of an honest day's work. I took a slow, deep sip of the bourbon. It tasted rich, smoky, and incredibly sweet. I had faced the ultimate betrayal. I had been dragged to the edge of the abyss by the people who were supposed to protect me. But I did not break. I did not fold. I used their own arrogance to completely dismantle their lives, and I emerged from the rubble stronger, wealthier, and entirely free. I raised my glass to the darkening sky, offering a silent, loving toast to Vivian. Her memory was safe. My dignity was perfectly intact. The architect was finally home, and the foundation was completely unbreakable. I am 72 years old. In this modern hyperspeed world, society looks at a man with gray hair, a slow, deliberate walk, and a polished wooden cane, and they see a target. They see an expiration date. They look at the elderly and assume our minds have dulled, that our sharp edges have completely rusted away, and that we are easily manipulated. Chad and his pretentious family looked at my weathered hands and assumed I was just a relic of the past. They saw a man who had outlived his usefulness and was simply waiting to be quietly pushed aside so they could feast on the valuable scraps of my lifelong labor. That is the fatal flaw of the arrogant youth. They confuse physical slowness with mental weakness. They do not understand that when you have spent half a century navigating the brutal, cutthroat machinery of a city like Chicago, you do not lose your edge. You just learn how to keep your blade completely hidden until the exact moment you need to strike. I spent my life drafting blueprints, calculating load-bearing limits, and anticipating structural failures long before the first brick was ever laid. Chad thought life was a sprint. He thought loud voices, aggressive posturing, and flashy designer suits equated to genuine power. But true power is incredibly quiet. True power is planting a seed, watering it diligently for decades, and knowing exactly which roots to sever when the tree becomes hopelessly rotten. I did not just defeat my son-in-law in a court of law, I gave him a brutal masterclass in the very reality he falsely thought he owned. And in doing so, I liberated myself from the heaviest burden a man can ever carry. The crushing expectation to endlessly provide for those who absolutely refuse to respect the hands that feed them. For years, I had allowed my unconditional love for Maya to blind me to her growing entitlement. I thought my job as a father was to constantly absorb the shockwaves of her bad decisions. But protecting someone from the consequences of their own actions does not save them. It merely delays their destruction. Tearing down that house, liquidating Chad's entire existence, and forcing Maya to stand on her own 2 feet was the ultimate act of tough love. It was a violent amputation of a toxic limb necessary to save the rest of the body. On a crisp Friday evening, several months after the dust from the demolition had completely settled, I walked into an exclusive, dimly lit jazz lounge in the heart of downtown Chicago. This was not a place for loud, desperate real estate brokers trying to impress each other with leased sports cars and fake watches. This was a true institution. The air was thick with the smooth, soulful sound of a live saxophone and the rich, comforting scent of aged oak and expensive cigars. I made my way to a private circular leather booth tucked away in the back corner of the room. Waiting for me were 3 men who had been my brothers in arms for over 40 years. Marcus, a retired Superior Court judge. Silas, a former union boss who practically built the electrical grid of the South Side. And Elias, a brilliant commercial architect who had partnered with me on dozens of major city projects. We were old men now. Our hair was white, our joints ached when the winter snow fell, and we all carried the invisible heavy scars of a lifetime spent fighting for our piece of the American dream. But as I slid into the booth surrounded by my true peers, I felt an incredible surge of absolute vitality. Silas signaled the waiter, an older gentleman who knew exactly what we required without a single word being spoken. He returned moments later carrying a bottle of vintage, highly allocated French wine. The kind of bottle that costs more than what Chad Preston used to make in an entire month. We did not drink it to show off. We drank it because we had survived the hardest decades of this country, and we had earned the right to taste the absolute best the world had to offer. The waiter poured the dark crimson liquid into our crystal glasses. I picked up my glass, feeling its heavy, elegant weight in my palm. Elias looked at me across the table, a deep, knowing smile playing on his lips. He raised his glass first. To Vincent, Elias said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying perfectly over the sound of the jazz band. The only man I know who can tear down a multi-million-dollar mansion, bankrupt a corporate shark, and build a permanent legacy all before his morning coffee. We all laughed. It was a rich, genuine sound that came from deep within our chests. It was the laughter of men who had seen it all and walked away victorious. I raised my glass to meet theirs. The crystal clinked together in the center of the table with a bright, clear resonance. To survival, I replied, and to the absolute magnificent freedom of cutting the dead weight loose. I took a slow sip of the wine. It was complex, layered, and incredibly smooth. I leaned back into the tufted leather booth, letting the music and the warmth of the room wash over me. For the first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely untethered. I was no longer the exhausted father trying to buy the loyalty of a daughter who had lost her way. I was no longer the invisible bank account funding the ungrateful arrogance of a pretentious son-in-law. I was simply Vincent Sterling, a master builder who had successfully demolished the ultimate betrayal and built a brand new empire on top of the rubble. My legacy was eternally secure. My wife's memory was beautifully immortalized in the scholarship fund that was already changing the lives of young, brilliant black students across the city. The storm was finally over, and the sunset was absolutely beautiful. Age does not equate to weakness, and silence should never be mistaken for surrender. When greed blinds people, they often underestimate the architects of their own existence. Family is a title earned through respect and loyalty, not a weapon to be wielded for financial gain. The greatest mistake the arrogant make is believing that power only belongs to the loud. In truth, the most devastating checkmates are planned quietly over time by those who have weathered the hardest storms. Never evict a builder from his own foundation. He knows exactly which pillars to pull to bring the roof crashing down on your head. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you think about how Chad and his arrogant family got exactly what they deserved in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of absolute undeniable justice. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.